Title: When the Sky Falls, Prologue. The night sky, once a symbol of hope, now shimmered with a terrifying omen. For centuries, humans had watched meteor showers in awe, harmless streaks of light, a cosmic dance that painted the heavens with fleeting brilliance. But what if those streaks weren't just stars? What if they were something far worse? On the night of the greatest meteor storm in recorded history, no one could have predicted that this spectacular event would be the harbinger of humanity's destruction. The first asteroid crashed. The world watched in horror as it tore through. The sky, no longer a gentle flash, but a fiery storm that screamed through the atmosphere. It wasn't a meteor. It was an invasion, and it had begun. As cities crumbled under the force of the strikes, one question remained on everyone's lips. What if this was only the beginning? Chapter 1. The beginning of the end. The night sky had always been a canvas of dreams, a vast expanse that stretched beyond imagination. For centuries, Earth's inhabitants had looked up, entranced by the glittering stars that painted their history in shimmering lights. Meteor showers had been a source of wonder, an annual gift from the heavens, a reminder of the universe's beauty and the smallness of humanity in the grand design. But tonight, something was different. Dr. Elara Voss stood at the window of her observatory, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the telescope's lens. She was an expert in astrophysics, one of the leading researchers in her field, and yet, something about tonight's meteor storm felt wrong. It wasn't the usual slow streaks of fire across the night sky. No, these were massive, jagged rocks, tumbling toward Earth with a violent urgency, as though pushed by an unseen hand. "Is this normal?" she whispered to herself, her voice swallowed by the quiet hum of the observatory. Her assistant, Lucas, who had been monitoring the storm's progress on the data screens, looked up from his console, his face pale. "No, Dr. Voss. I've never seen anything like this. The asteroids, they're too big, too fast. Something's off." Elara's brow furrowed. She knew the sky had always held secrets, but this was beyond anything they had ever encountered. They had been watching the meteor showers for hours, expecting nothing more than the usual natural phenomenon. Yet these objects were not behaving like meteors. Suddenly a blinding light filled the sky as a massive asteroid tore through the atmosphere. The ground beneath their feet trembled as an explosion of sound and light echoed through the observatory. The room vibrated, the glass window rattling violently. "Get down!" Elara screamed, her heart racing. Lucas stumbled backward, his face wide with shock. The force of the explosion sent a shockwave through the building. As the sound began to die down, the walls groaned and the lights flickered. Elara's mind raced. "This can't be right, this can't be happening." She dashed to the console, pulling up the latest data. Her breath hitched as she watched the trajectory of the largest asteroid, the one that had just struck. Its path was direct, aimed at the heart of New York City. "There's no way to stop it," Lucas muttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's not a meteor," Elara whispered, the weight of the realization sinking in. She had studied asteroids her entire life, and this was no accident. This was deliberate. A deep rumble echoed from the sky as another asteroid crashed into a remote part of the city, sending plumes of smoke and debris rising into the air. On the monitors, the devastation was clear. Massive fires, crumbling buildings, and chaos in the streets. "We have to warn someone." "Warn now," Elara said urgently, her hands flying over the console, trying to reach the global networks. But before she could make contact, a new notification flashed across the screen, an alert that made her blood run cold. Satellite observations. A significant increase in asteroid impacts detected across the globe. Major cities in danger. It wasn't just New York. Every major city, every corner of the world was now at risk. Elara's mind raced. Who would do this? The sky had always been a source of awe, a place of mystery. But this was not natural. These asteroids weren't just random debris from space. They were a signal. Chapter 2. The truth comes crashing down. The world had never been more connected or more vulnerable. Within hours of the first asteroid strike, every major government had declared a state of emergency. Cities were plunged into chaos as the world's leaders scrambled to make sense of the destruction. Satellites launched to monitor the incoming storm had been wiped out, communication networks were down, and global panic set in. In the midst of the turmoil, Elara and Lucas found themselves fighting to be heard amidst the cacophony of disbelief and fear. "I'm telling you, this is no accident," Elara repeated to the gathering of military officials, scientists, and government leaders in an emergency meeting. "These asteroids were deliberately sent here." One of the generals, his face hard and determined, scoffed. "Dr. Voss, you're telling me that someone planned this? That aliens, or whatever you're implying, launched a full-scale attack on Earth using asteroids as weapons?" Elara nodded, solemnly, the weight of her words pressing down on her chest. "Yes, the trajectory of the strikes isn't random. It's calculated. These impacts are coordinated. And from what I've gathered, the debris they've left behind contains alien technology." The room fell into a stunned silence. "What kind of technology?" another official asked, his voice filled with skepticism. "I don't know yet. But it's clear that the asteroids are more than just space rocks. They're carriers. Vehicles designed to bring something else." Elara turned to the large screen behind her, which now displayed a detailed map of the asteroid impacts. The most recent strike had landed in the heart of New York City, and another was already approaching Los Angeles. The map indicated more were coming, each one worse than the last. "We have to figure out what's inside these asteroids or we're all doomed," Elara said, her voice trembling with urgency. "They're not just destroying our cities, they're preparing the ground for something far worse." Before anyone could respond, a loud beep sounded from the communication console at the far end of the room. The screen flickered to life, revealing a blurry, distorted image of a man, someone Elara recognized immediately. "Dr. Voss," said the voice, its distortion making it almost unrecognizable. "You need to listen carefully. You're not just dealing with a random alien species. This is the work of the Goros." Elara froze. The Goros were a name whispered in the most secretive circles of Earth's scientific community. An ancient race that had disappeared millennia ago, leaving no trace of their existence, save for rumors and obscure legends. Some believed they had once ruled the stars, but no one had ever confirmed their true nature. "What are the Goros?" Lucas asked, leaning forward in his chair. "They are an advanced alien civilization," Elara said, her voice shaky. "They've been hiding in the shadows of the universe for eons. We thought they were long gone, lost to time. But now they've returned, and they're using these asteroids to terraform Earth for their own purposes." The man on the screen nodded gravely. "The Goros have been preparing for this for centuries. The asteroids, they're only the first step. They have already infiltrated your governments, your military forces. You cannot trust anyone. They are among you." The room fell into an eerie silence, the weight of the words hanging heavily in the air. The truth had come crashing down. Earth was under attack, and the invaders weren't just coming from the stars. They had been here all along. Chapter 3. The Enemy Among Us. The revelation hit harder than the asteroids themselves. Humanity had always prided itself on its ability to rise above threats, to face the unknown with courage and determination. But the enemy they were now facing was different. It wasn't a traditional invasion force. There were no massive fleets, no warships. The enemy had infiltrated. It had bided its time. The Goros had been waiting, lurking in the shadows, studying humanity for millennia, and now they were ready to strike. Elara paced back and forth in the briefing room, her mind spinning. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. The Goros were using the meteors as a cover, but why? What were they really after? "Dr. Voss," Lucas called from across the room, snapping her from her thoughts. "There's something you need to see." Elara walked over to the screen where Lucas had pulled up a feed. The image was grainy, distorted, but there was no mistaking. This was an alien craft, It was massive, cloaked in an energy field, its shape almost organic, pulsating with a strange light. It was hovering above the Earth, just outside the atmosphere. "Is that a Goros ship?" Elara whispered, her heart racing. "I think so," Lucas replied, his voice barely audible. "And if this thing is real, then they're not just hiding among us. They've been waiting." Elara's thoughts began to race. The Goros had always been elusive, their motives unclear. But now, with the meteor strikes and the alien craft hovering in Earth's orbit, one thing was certain: the time for hiding was over. Humanity was about to face its greatest challenge yet, and it wasn't just about surviving the asteroid impacts. The real fight was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Fight for Survival. The morning after the meeting in the high-security briefing room felt like the calm before a storm. In a way it was, but that storm was now inevitable. The asteroid impacts had been the first wave, a brutal but calculated introduction to the terror that was about to unfold. The Goros were real, and they were here. They had only begun their assault. Elara spent the night pacing in her apartment, unable to rest. The reality of what she had learned, the deepening horror of the situation, had yet to sink in. The Goros, hidden among humanity for centuries, had orchestrated this entire catastrophe. They had already begun to infiltrate Earth's governments and military forces. She shuddered as she remembered the words from the transmission earlier. "The Goros are among you." It wasn't just a statement. It was a warning. Elara wasn't the only one in turmoil. Across the globe, cities were burning, families were being torn apart, and governments were scrambling for answers they didn't have. The first wave of attacks was only the beginning. The Goros were methodical, meticulous. Everything was part of a larger plan. This wasn't just an invasion. It was the beginning of humanity's extinction. And in this nightmare, the world's survival rested on the shoulders of a few scattered individuals. People who were now facing the horrifying truth that not only did they have to fight the Goros, but they also had to fight the people who had already fallen under their control. The resistance forms Elara wasn't sure who to trust anymore. The sheer scale of the infiltration had shattered everything she believed about humanity. Yet, in the darkest moments of crisis, something inside her hardened. She wasn't going to let the Goros win. She couldn't. After the meeting, she gathered a small group of trusted individuals. Lucas, of course, and others. Scientists, military strategists, and even ordinary civilians, each with a crucial piece of the puzzle. Together they formed an underground resistance. There was no longer any time for hesitation. Their plan was simple but dangerous. They needed to find and destroy the Goros' central command center, believed to be located somewhere in the ruins of an ancient city long buried beneath Earth's surface. According to their research, this site would hold the key to both the Goros' invasion plans and the advanced alien technology they had left behind. Elara's mind raced with one central question. How could she fight an enemy who was not only technologically superior, but also already inside their very ranks? For now, they had one advantage: the asteroids. As the Goros had begun to terraform Earth with their debris, some of the alien technology was inadvertently exposed to Earth's atmosphere. This had given the resistance a small window of opportunity. If they could reverse engineer even a fraction of the alien technology, they might have a fighting chance. But the clock was ticking. A desperate mission. The plan was risky. They had no idea what to expect once they infiltrated the ancient city, and time was rapidly running out. As the global governments collapsed under the pressure of the Goros' growing control, the resistance became Earth's last hope. "We can't wait any longer," Elara said, her voice steel-strong as she addressed the group. They were gathered in a hidden command room deep beneath the ruins of a once thriving metropolis. The city was no more than a shadow of its former self, a battleground now. The resistance members had spent days scavenging for weapons, supplies, and intel, anything that might give them an edge over the invaders. Lucas looked over the plans they had recovered from intercepted communications. According to our sources, the Goro's central command should be within the ruins of this city a few miles from here. We can't afford to waste any more time. Then it's decided, Elara said, looking at each of her comrades. We move out at dawn. Everyone knows their role, no mistakes. The mission was set. But despite the resolve she projected, Elara couldn't shake the sense of dread. They weren't just facing an invasion. They were up against something ancient, something whose motives and reach were far beyond their understanding. As night fell, Elara found herself staring out at the wreckage outside the hidden base. The firelight reflected off the distant horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The world was on the brink. It felt as though the ground itself was trembling in anticipation of what was to come. Into the heart of the ruins at dawn, they set out in silence, the tension palpable among the group. They traveled in a convoy of armored vehicles, navigating through the wreckage of cities that had once been teeming with life. The streets were eerily empty now, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of distant engines or the sound of debris scraping across the cracked concrete. Stay alert, Elara said over the comms as they approached the ruins. We don't know what we're going to find. The ancient city was unlike anything they had encountered before. Towering structures that looked almost organic, twisted, jagged, as though nature itself had shaped them, lined the streets. Their surfaces glowed faintly with an otherworldly light, a constant reminder that this place had once been home to beings far more advanced than humanity. As the convoy wound its way deeper into the ruins, they encountered no resistance. No Goros, no traps, nothing. It was as though the city was waiting for them, as though the Goros knew they were coming. The stillness was suffocating. We've got to be close, Lucas muttered, checking his maps and radar. According to the intel, the command center should be beneath this structure. Elara nodded. Let's move in, quickly. They disembarked from their vehicles, moving in tight formation as they approached the entrance to what appeared to be an ancient temple-like structure. The air grew colder the closer they got, and the faint hum of energy pulsed in the ground beneath their feet. Here, Elara said, stopping in front of a large ornate door that seemed to be made from a combination of metal and stone. It was engraved with strange symbols, alien writing that pulsed with light. The markings seemed almost alive. One of the soldiers stepped forward and touched the door. To their surprise, it slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. The interior was vast, with high ceilings and walls covered in intricate carvings. But what caught Elara's attention were the faint traces of alien technology scattered throughout the room. Some of the devices resembled the artifacts found in the asteroid debris, but these were far more advanced. Stay close, she whispered, her heart pounding. We don't know what's in there. As they ventured deeper into the ruins, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but there was no time. The fate of the world depended on what they could find here. They reached the center of the room, a massive chamber dominated by a glowing sphere that seemed to pulse with energy. The floor was covered in strange symbols, and the walls were lined with intricate alien technology. This is it, Elara breathed. This is the heart of their operation. But before she could make a move toward the sphere, a loud, mechanical screech echoed through the chamber, followed by a low, rumbling growl. The ground beneath their feet began to shake, and a doorway on the far side of the chamber slammed open. And then they emerged, the Goros. Their true form, unlike anything humanity had ever imagined, tall, skeletal beings, their bodies a fusion of organic matter and metallic alloys. Their eyes glowed with a cold, calculating light, and their movements were unnervingly fluid. The resistance was surrounded. We've been waiting for you, the leader of the Goros said, its voice a chilling mix of tones. Did you really think you could stop us? The battle had begun. Chapter 5. The Last Stand. The moment the Goros emerged from the shadows of the ancient chamber, a wave of cold terror washed over the resistance. It was as though the very air had thickened, pressing down on their chests. The strange, skeletal figures towered over them, their eerie, glowing eyes scanning the group with a cold indifference. Their presence alone sent a chill through Elara's spine. The chamber was silent, except for the low hum of the alien technology surrounding them. The sphere in the center seemed to pulse in time with the beating of Elara's heart. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and rapid. Behind her, the rest of the resistance stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. They had come prepared for a battle, but none of them had expected the enemy to appear like this. "Did you really think you could stop us?" The leader of the Goros spoke again, its voice unnatural, distorted, as though multiple voices were layered on top of one another, each one cold and calculating. Elara's mind raced. How had they known we were coming? They had taken every precaution, moved quietly through the ruins, and yet here they were. The Goros had been waiting. Before anyone could respond, the leader raised a long, bony arm, and the room seemed to vibrate with an unnatural force. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and Elara's team staggered to keep their balance. The sphere in the center of the room began to glow brighter, its energy crackling as it powered up. "We've known of your kind for millennia," the Goros leader continued, its voice filling the chamber. "The Goros have watched as your species has flourished and faltered. But now, your time has come to an end." "End?" Lucas spat, stepping forward, his weapon raised. "You think you can just wipe us out?" The Goros leader tilted its head slightly, as if considering Lucas's challenge. Then it extended a sharp, metallic arm toward the resistance group, and with a sudden motion, the room filled with an ear-splitting screech, as if metal scraping against metal. The Goros' power was overwhelming. Elara's entire body was thrown backward, as if an invisible force had struck her. "Stay down!" shouted one of the soldiers, pushing Elara to the ground as the shockwave hit. But it was too late. The resistance had already been hit by the full force of the Goros weapon. Elara struggled to her feet, her vision blurry. The room was in chaos. Some of her comrades were already on the ground, while others fought to regain their footing. It felt as though they were trapped in a nightmare. The Goros leader did not wait for the resistance to recover. With a chilling command, it gestured again, and the floor beneath them seemed to collapse. A thick, metallic barrier shot up from the ground, surrounding the group and trapping them in a cage-like structure. "No one escapes," the Goros leader said simply. "This is the end of your resistance." The unseen weapon. The resistance was surrounded, their weapons rendered useless by the Goros' advanced technology. The metallic barrier hummed with energy, preventing any escape. Elara gritted her teeth, her mind working furiously to find a way out. This can't be it. It can't end here. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of the Goros leader extending its hand toward the glowing sphere in the center of the room. There was a momentary flash of light, and then the sphere began to spin faster, its light intensifying until it was blinding. "Do you understand?" the leader asked, its tone condescending. "This weapon is the culmination of centuries of preparation. A weapon designed to alter your planet permanently. It is not just a weapon of destruction. It is a tool of transformation." As the Goros leader spoke, a series of tendrils like dark energy threads shot from the sphere, wrapping around the metal cage that held the resistance. The tendrils seemed to pulse with life, drawing in energy from the surrounding alien machinery. "The Earth will be transformed," the Goros leader continued. "Your species will serve us, just as you have served as pawns for so long. Time for resistance is over." Elara's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. A transformation? What was the Goros leader talking about? It was clear that their plans weren't just about destruction. They had something far more insidious in mind, and whatever it was tied to the technology within this ruined city, and to the mysterious glowing sphere in the center of the room. Just as Elara thought she might lose her composure, she noticed something small, but significant. The Goros leader, despite its imposing presence, seemed distracted by the sphere. The tendrils that it had sent out were connected to the sphere, and for a brief moment, Elara saw a flicker in the energy field surrounding it. It was subtle, but it was there. Elara's eyes narrowed. That's it, the sphere. It's the key. Without thinking, she reached for her weapon, which had been knocked out of her hand moments earlier. Grabbing it from the ground, she signaled for Lucas and the others to stay down and keep their distance. She wasn't sure if they could defeat the Goros at this point, but there was one thing she could do. She focused all her energy on the glowing sphere. She didn't have time to figure out its full mechanics, but she knew enough to understand that it was the source of the Goros' power in this chamber. If she could disable it, if she could destroy the connection between the sphere and the Goros, it might give them a fighting chance. With a deep breath, Elara aimed her weapon at the sphere and fired. The blast struck the center of the sphere with a deafening crack. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the sphere exploded in a burst of brilliant, blinding light. The entire chamber seemed to shake violently as the explosion sent shockwaves through the structure. The resistance members struggled to stay on their feet as the Goros' leader let out an inhuman scream of rage. The metallic barrier surrounding them flickered and began to crack, the tendrils dissipating in the aftermath of the blast. Elara's heart pounded as she scanned the room, watching the once imposing Goros leader stumble backward. The shockwave had weakened its grip on the chamber's power, and the energy field was beginning to fail. "We have to move," Elara shouted, pushing through the pain in her chest. She looked over at Lucas, who was already helping a wounded soldier to his feet. "Do you think we've won?" The Goros leader growled, recovering its composure. Its eyes flared with hatred as it fixed its gaze on Elara. "This is only a small setback. You cannot fight what has already been set in motion." Before Elara could respond, the Goros leader raised its hand, summoning another wave of energy. This time the room shuddered as the walls began to close in. But Elara was ready. With one final, desperate push, she aimed her weapon at the weak points in the walls, places where the energy field was now compromised, and fired. The room exploded in a cascade of sparks and energy, the walls collapsing as the last of the Goros' power in the chamber crumbled. The resistance, battered but alive, stumbled out of the wreckage, the room now a scene of devastation. "We're not done yet," Elara said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming exhaustion. "This was just the beginning. We've stopped them here, but the real fight is still ahead." As she looked out over the ruined chamber, Elara knew one thing for certain: the battle was far from over. The Goros were not just an external threat. They had been here on Earth for far too long. And now the fight for humanity's survival was about to enter its darkest phase. Chapter 6. Shadows of the past, the days that followed the destruction of the alien sphere were fraught with uncertainty. Elara and the remnants of the resistance had managed to escape the crumbling ruins, but they knew that they had only temporarily halted the Goros' advance. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The Goros were still here, hidden, manipulating, waiting for the right moment to strike again. After escaping the chamber, Elara ordered the team to retreat to one of their hidden safe houses. It was an old military bunker, buried deep beneath the surface. The bunker was stocked with supplies, weapons, and communication equipment, everything the resistance needed to regroup and plan their next move. But even in the safety of their underground refuge, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Is everyone all right?" she asked, as she paced the command room, her eyes scanning the group. The faces of her comrades were grim. The loss of their brothers and sisters in the battle weighed heavily on them all. The Goros' power had left a deep mark on them, a fear they couldn't shake. Lucas stood at the far side of the room, checking the data they had recovered. "From the ancient city, we've got a few leads, but nothing concrete. The sphere's destruction might have disrupted some of their operations, but we don't know how much." Elara sighed. It was the truth. They had no idea how much damage they had caused. The Goros were ancient, far more advanced than anything humanity could fathom. The weapons they wielded were incomprehensible, and the true depth of their invasion was still shrouded in mystery. One of the soldiers, a woman named Tessa, spoke up. "We can't just sit here. If we wait too long, we'll lose whatever advantage we might have. We need to strike back now. I agree, Elara said, turning toward Tessa. But we need to be smart about this. We don't know what the Goros have left in their arsenal. They'll be looking for us, and we can't risk walking into another trap. But what if they come after us first? Lucas asked, his voice edged with concern. If they've been here for centuries, they'll have plans in place to hunt us down. We'll have to keep moving, Elara replied. We can't afford to stay in one place for too long. But before we go, we need to understand more about them. We need to find out how they operate, what they want, and how to stop them. If we can't figure that out, we're just blindly fighting a war we don't understand. Unearthing the truth, the next few hours were spent poring over the data they had collected from the ruins. It was a painstaking process. Elara had hoped to find some form of communication or ancient records that could explain the Goros' origins or their motives. But all she found were fragmented pieces of a history long buried. Lucas worked tirelessly, decoding the alien symbols and trying to make sense of the fragmented messages left behind. As he worked, he muttered to himself, the lines of concentration deepening on his face. I think I've found something, Lucas said suddenly, his voice tinged with both excitement and uncertainty. This could be it. There's a reference to something called the siphon, and it's linked to the destruction of entire planets. Elara's heart skipped a beat. The siphon? What is it? I'm not sure yet, Lucas replied, tapping at the screen. But it looks like a device. It was mentioned in several places, and there's a reference to it being used to siphon energy from a planet's core, essentially draining it dry. A device that drains a planet's core? Elara echoed. That sounds impossible. I thought so too, Lucas said. But the more I look into it, the more it makes sense. If the Goros are using this technology, it could explain their ability to transform the planet. They're not just invading. They're harvesting. Elara absorbed the information. The Goros had been using Earth as a resource, draining its life force, its energy, its very core. The devastation of the asteroid impacts, the climate changes, the destruction of cities, it all made sense now. It was not just an invasion. It was a siphoning of Earth's very soul. So they want to destroy Earth to fuel their own empire? Tessa asked, her voice low. It's possible, Elara replied. But we need to confirm this. We need to find the siphon and stop it before it's too late. The journey to the core with new purpose. Elara and the Resistance set out once again, this time with a clearer goal. Find the siphon and stop the Goros from draining Earth's core. The journey would take them deep into the heart of the planet, to a place that had never been explored by human beings, a place that had been sealed away for centuries. According to the data, the siphon was located beneath the surface, in a vast hidden cavern system beneath the ruins of an ancient city. This city had been built by an unknown civilization, long before humanity had even emerged, and its ruins had remained hidden for millennia. The path to the siphon was treacherous. As they made their way deeper into the earth, the air grew heavier, the pressure increasing with every step. The heat from the planet's core was palpable, and the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The further they descended, the more they began to feel the weight of the Goros' presence. It was as if they were being drawn into a trap. Elara didn't voice her concerns, but they all felt it, the sense that they were being watched, that the Goros knew they were coming. It was only a matter of time before the Goros would strike. This place is like nothing I've ever seen, Tessa remarked, her voice echoing in the cavern. The walls were smooth, as if carved by some ancient unknown force, and strange markings covered the stone. The air was thick with the smell of metal, and something old. The Goros have been here a long time, Lucas murmured. And if this is where the siphon is, then we're walking right into their lair. I know, Elara said, her voice grim. But we don't have a choice. If we don't stop the siphon, Earth is finished. They pressed on, moving cautiously through the labyrinthine tunnels. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in on them, and strange, flickering lights danced across the stone. The resistance was on edge, every step feeling like it might be their last. After what felt like hours, they reached the heart of the cavern. At the center stood a massive structure, partly organic, partly mechanical, its design impossible to describe. It was like something out of a nightmare, an enormous twisting coil of metal and bone wrapped around a glowing core. "This is it," Elara whispered, her breath catching in her throat. "The siphon." Before they could make a move, a voice echoed through the chamber. "Welcome," the voice said, low and resonant. It was not human, it was the voice of the Goros leader. "You are too late." Chapter 7. The Heart of the Storm. The voice of the Goros leader reverberated through the cavern, chilling Elara to her core. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The air was thick with the unmistakable sense of impending doom, as if the very walls around them were closing in. "You are too late," the voice continued, its cold tone dripping with contempt. "The siphon is already activated. You cannot stop what has already begun." Elara gritted her teeth, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. Her fingers brushed the hilt of the pulse gun, but she knew that nothing they had would be enough to destroy this ancient machine. This weapon designed to siphon the very life from Earth. "We've come this far," Elara muttered, more to herself than to the others. "We're not turning back now." The resistance was silent, the weight of their situation sinking in. Their mission had always been a desperate one, but now it felt almost impossible. They were in the heart of the Goros' power, surrounded by their advanced technology, and facing an enemy that had been lurking in the shadows for centuries. "You are nothing but insects," the voice of the Goros leader mocked, its presence growing stronger in the cavern. Elara could feel the vibrations of its energy coursing through the stone beneath her feet. "This planet will be ours, just as all others have been." For a brief moment, Elara thought she heard something more than just the Goros leader's voice, a deep, unsettling hum beneath the words, as if the very air around them was alive. The siphon. It was resonating with power, pulsing in rhythm with the heartbeat of the earth. "You'll destroy us all," Lucas said, his voice strained but determined. "But you won't win. You'll never control this world." Elara shot him a glance, then turned back toward the massive structure that loomed before them. The siphon. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, its shape constantly shifting, part organic, part mechanical. Tendrils of energy seemed to flow through it, wrapping around the core in the center, which glowed with an unearthly light. The siphon's power surged, and Elara felt it, a heavy pull deep in her chest, as if the world itself was being drained. She could hear it now, the low, humming frequency of the siphon amplifying as it activated. The energy of the planet was being siphoned away, feeding into the machine. "We need to shut it down," Elara said, her voice urgent, "before it's too late." Tessa, who had been studying the structure, nodded. "It's connected to the heart of the planet. We can't just pull the plug on it. We need to destroy the core of the siphon, disable it from within." Lucas's eyes widened. "That's suicide. We have no idea what kind of defenses it has." "It's our only chance," Elara said, her voice steady despite the chaos of thoughts racing through her mind. "We have no time left." With that, they began to move toward the siphon, the ground beneath them rumbling with each step. As they approached, the walls of the cavern seemed to close in even tighter, and a low, guttural growl filled the air, something primal, something ancient. The Goros were close. The Goros' arrival. The temperature in the cavern suddenly dropped, and a ripple of dread passed through the resistance. The shadows seemed to move, stretching and warping as if alive. And then they appeared, Goros soldiers, emerging from the darkness, their forms thin and skeletal, their glowing eyes scanning the room. The air crackled with the energy of their weapons as they raised their arms, preparing to fire. Elara felt her pulse race. They were trapped. "You will not leave this place," the leader's voice boomed, reverberating through the walls. "You will not stop the siphon. You are too weak to stand against the power we possess." The Goros soldiers moved forward, their movements swift and eerily synchronized. Elara had no choice. She shouted orders to her team. "Defend the entrance," she commanded. "Hold them off as long as you can. We're going to destroy the siphon." Without waiting for a response, Elara dashed forward, racing toward the massive structure at the heart of the cavern. She could hear the crackle of energy behind her as Lucas, Tessa, and the others took up defensive positions, weapons raised. The sound of gunfire and explosions echoed through the cavern, but Elara's focus remained on the siphon. As she neared it, a sudden burst of energy shot out from the core, slamming into her with such force that she was thrown backward. Her body slammed against the cold stone, and for a moment the world spun around her. She struggled to regain her footing, her head pounding. "You cannot stop us," the Goros leader taunted once more. "This is the beginning of the end for your species." Elara shook off the dizziness, her heart racing. They had to act fast. She turned toward Lucas and Tessa, who were engaged in fierce combat with the Goros soldiers, holding their ground as best as they could. "Elara," Lucas shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "We need to stop that thing now. We can't keep fighting them forever." "I'm on it," Elara shouted back. She looked up at the siphon. The structure seemed to grow larger and more intimidating as she approached. The core at its center pulsed with an unnatural glow, and tendrils of energy wrapped around it, feeding it power. "Elara," Tessa's voice cut through the noise of battle. "Get back here, it's too dangerous." But Elara didn't hesitate. The siphon was her target. She had no choice but to get close enough to find a way to disable it. She sprinted toward the core, weaving through the tendrils of energy that lashed out at her. The air was thick with the hum of power, the very fabric of reality seeming to distort around her. The ground beneath her feet was trembling, and she could feel the pull of the siphon's power trying to drag her into its gravitational field. She reached the base of the structure, and without pausing, she began searching for any weak points, anything that could allow them to disable the core. Her fingers ran along the smooth metallic surface, her heart hammering in her chest. Every second counted. Suddenly, she found it, an opening in the structure just large enough for her to slip through. She forced herself into the opening, her body tense with fear and adrenaline. The inside of the siphon was a labyrinth of wires and conduits, glowing with a sickly green light. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and the oppressive weight of the energy flowing through the machine. The core was directly ahead, pulsing with unnatural energy. It was connected to every part of the structure, tendrils of power stretching out from it in every direction. "Elara," Lucas's voice crackled through her calm. "We can't hold them off much longer. What's your status?" "I'm almost there," Elara replied through gritted teeth. "I need a few more seconds." She reached out, pulling a small device. From her belt, one of the last pieces of experimental tech the Resistance had salvaged. It was a power disruptor designed to short-circuit energy fields like the one surrounding the siphon's core. She activated it, watching as it crackled with energy, sending a pulse of interference into the machine. For a moment, nothing happened. The siphon continued to hum, its energy flowing steadily. But then, a low tremor rippled through the structure, and the core flickered. "Yes," Elara whispered. "It's working." But just as she began to breathe a sigh of relief, the Goros leader's voice filled her mind, cold and threatening. "You think you can destroy us?" it asked. "This is just the beginning, Elara. You are merely delaying the inevitable." The walls around her began to shake violently as the siphon fought back, its core growing brighter, more unstable. Elara knew it was now or never. She activated the disruptor one last time, pouring all of its energy into the core. The explosion was deafening. Chapter 8. The Price of Resistance. The explosion echoed through the cavern like the roar of a collapsing star, sending shock waves that rattled the very bones of the Resistance. Elara was thrown backward as the core of the siphon detonated with a violent burst of energy, blinding light flashing in all directions. Her vision blurred, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and ozone. For a moment, she could only hear the ringing in her ears. Her body ached, and her head spun. She scrambled to her feet, struggling to make sense of the chaos around her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the force of the explosion still reverberating through her chest. "Elara!" Tessa's voice rang out, panic and urgency in her tone. "Where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm here," Elara said through gritted teeth, pushing herself to her feet. The world around her was a haze of smoke and dust, the cavern slowly coming back into focus. The siphon's core had been destroyed, but the damage was far from done. The ground beneath her trembled again, and she felt the familiar pull of the Goro's power, stronger now than before. Something was wrong. The siphon might have been disabled, but its destruction had unleashed something far more dangerous. "You have made a grave mistake," the Goro's leader's voice boomed, filled with rage. It reverberated through the walls, the sound almost physical in its intensity. "The siphon was only a tool. You will see the true cost of your defiance." Suddenly, the cavern began to shift. The walls cracked and groaned, and the air seemed to warp with an almost tangible force. It was as if the entire structure was coming alive. The stone beneath Elara's feet vibrated, and she saw the tendrils of energy that had once connected the siphon now swirling around her like hungry serpents. "Elara!" Lucas shouted, his voice crackling through the comm. "The Goros are activating something else. We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The walls around them buckled and split open, revealing deep, jagged fissures. From those cracks emerged more Goro soldiers, dozens, hundreds, emerging from hidden tunnels in the rock. They moved with terrifying speed. Their glowing eyes locked onto the resistance team with the cold precision of a predator, closing in on its prey. "You will all die here," the leader's voice said, its tone laced with venom. "The siphon was just the beginning. The planet's core is now ours to consume. You are too late to stop what has already begun." The ground trembled again, this time with an intensity that sent a ripple of panic through the resistance. Elara looked around, her mind racing for a solution. They had no choice but to fight. There was no retreat. The Goros were everywhere, and the cavern was closing in on them. The planet's core was under siege, and they were the last line of defense. "Elara, we can't hold them off much longer," Tessa yelled. "We need to get out of here, now!" Elara's gaze shifted to the towering, collapsing structure that had once been the siphon. The energy it had unleashed was growing exponentially, causing the very earth to quake beneath their feet. It was clear now that the Goros had been using the siphon to siphon off more than just Earth's core. They were drawing from something far deeper, a well of unimaginable power that, once unleashed, would consume the planet itself. "No," Elara muttered to herself, her voice tinged with disbelief. They can't have already activated it." "What?" Lucas asked, voice tight with urgency. "Activated what?" "The cradle," Elara whispered. "The true weapon. The siphon was just a means to an end. The cradle is a planetary-level device. If it's activated, it's capable of consuming everything. Life, energy, the entire planet." Tessa's eyes widened. "You're saying they've already begun?" "Yes," Elara replied grimly, "and we need to stop it before Earth is consumed." The cradle of destruction. The walls of the cavern continued to crack and groan as the true nature of the Goros' plans became clear. The cradle, as Elara had called it, was a weapon older than civilization itself. It was a device buried deep within the planet, hidden beneath layers of rock and time. And now it was awakening. Elara turned to the others, her mind working at 1,000 miles per hour. The Goros had made their move, and there was no stopping them now unless they could somehow reach the cradle's control center. "We have to get to the control center," Elara said urgently, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her chest. "If we can shut it down, we might still have a chance to save Earth." The resistance team moved quickly, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The Goros soldiers were closing in from every direction, but they had no choice but to keep moving. Elara's pulse quickened as she led the team deeper into the labyrinthine cavern system. They had no maps, no clear idea of where the control center was, but they had no other option. The walls around them pulsed with energy, and the cavern seemed to be alive, reacting to their presence. The very air hummed with power, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. It was clear that the cradle was drawing power from the planet's core, and with every passing second, it was getting stronger. "Move!" Elara shouted, her eyes scanning the shifting landscape for any sign of the control center. She could feel the Goros closing in on them, the weight of their pursuit pressing down on her. They had to hurry. Ahead of them, a large glowing portal flickered into existence. It was a breach in the rock, a gateway seemingly made of pure energy, its edges crackling with a sickly green light. "That's it," Lucas shouted, his voice filled with hope. "That's the way in." But before they could make a move, a group of Goros soldiers emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. The air grew heavy, the atmosphere thick with an almost oppressive force. The resistance team came to a halt, weapons raised, preparing for the fight of their lives. "Elara, we don't have time for this," Tessa yelled, her eyes darting to the portal. "We need to push through now." The Goros leader's voice echoed in their minds once more, cold and mocking. "You cannot stop us, Elara." The voice boomed, sending a ripple of dread through her. "The cradle will soon be fully activated. Earth's core is already ours. You are too weak to challenge the might of the Goros." The soldiers closed in, their weapons raised. But Elara wasn't listening to the Goros leader. She was focused on the portal. This was their only chance. Fire. Elara shouted. The resistance team opened fire, their weapons lighting up the dark cavern with pulses of energy. But the Goros soldiers were fast, too fast. They dodged, parried, and returned fire with deadly precision. The air was thick with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the shrill screams of combat. Elara didn't have time to think. She rushed forward, her feet pounding against the rocky floor, her heart in her throat. She had to get through that portal. There was no other way. With a sudden burst of energy, she leaped into the portal, her body enveloped in a blinding light. A new world. When the light faded, Elara found herself standing in a vast, open chamber, its walls stretching infinitely upward, disappearing into shadow. The air was cold, unnervingly sterile. The ground was smooth, metallic, and perfectly flat, as though it had never been touched by anything living. In the center of the room stood a massive control panel, connected to the cradle by a series of pulsating energy conduits. The device was enormous, easily the size of a city block, its form sleek and elegant yet ominous in its design. At its core, the heart of the machine pulsed with the raw power of the planet itself, drawing energy from the very core of Earth. The cradle. "Elara, we found it." Lucas's voice broke through her thoughts, his words filled with both awe and terror. "This is it. We're in the heart of it." She nodded grimly, her heart pounding in her chest. They were deep inside the heart of the Goros' plan. But now that they were here, the true challenge lay in stopping the cradle from consuming everything. "We have to destroy it," Elara said, her voice steady. "Now." Chapter 9. The Last Stand. The control room hummed with a low mechanical pulse, a sound that reverberated through Elara's bones like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. The walls were smooth and featureless, but the sheer size of the chamber made her feel small, insignificant in the presence of something so ancient, so vast. The cradle loomed before her, its massive form pulsating with a sickly green light. Tendrils of energy surged out from its core, snaking along the floor like serpents seeking their prey. Elara felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders, suffocating her. Time was running out. "We don't have much time," Lucas said, his voice urgent. His eyes scanned the control panel in front of them, which pulsed with chaotic energy. "The cradle's power is growing exponentially. We need to shut it down before it gets any stronger." Elara nodded grimly, her gaze fixed on the intricate network of conduits that led from the cradle's core to the control panel. She could feel the energy coursing through the room, an electric charge in the air like the calm before a storm. The planet's very heartbeat was tied to the cradle. If they couldn't stop it now, The world would be lost forever. Tessa, who had been silent until now, stepped forward and examined the control panel closely. It's going to take all of us to disable this thing. We need to overload the power. Conduits, disrupt the energy flow and shut it down at the source. I don't think we have enough time for a clean shutdown, Elara said, her voice tight. The Goros are coming. If we don't destroy it completely, Earth is finished. Lucas gave her a grim look. Then we'll do whatever it takes. The Goros close in as if on cue. A loud screech echoed through the chamber, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots on metal. Elara's heart skipped a beat. The Goros had found them. Prepare yourselves, Elara said, her voice firm. We fight until we finish this. No retreat. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and before they could react, the doors to the chamber slammed open, revealing a wave of Goros soldiers, their glowing eyes burning with hatred. Their skeletal forms moved in perfect synchrony, weapons raised, their expressions devoid of mercy. You cannot stop us. The Goros leader's voice rang out, amplified by a strange ethereal quality. This is the end for you. You cannot defeat the cradle, another Goros soldier hissed. It is beyond your comprehension. Earth will be consumed just as the others were. Elara's grip tightened around her weapon. She didn't respond to their taunts. There was no time for that now. Every second spent fighting was a second wasted. Fire! Elara shouted. The resistance team opened fire, the sound of gunshots and explosions filling the chamber. The Goros soldiers advanced with terrifying speed, their movements fluid and precise. It was as though they had no fear, no hesitation. They simply were, and they were coming for them. Tessa fired a burst of energy from her rifle, striking one of the soldiers in the chest, but the Goros simply shrugged off the attack, their bodies seemingly impervious to most weapons. The sheer number of them was overwhelming. Elara could see Lucas and Tessa fighting valiantly, but it was clear that the odds were quickly turning against them. Elara, Tessa shouted, her voice strained. We can't hold them off forever. We don't need to hold them off forever, Elara said, her mind racing. We just need to buy enough time for the shutdown sequence. She turned to Lucas, who was fighting back to back with her, his eyes focused on the control panel. Can you trigger the shutdown remotely? She asked. Lucas hesitated for a moment, his fingers dancing over the console in front of him. I can try, he said, but it's going to take time to bypass the security protocols. I'll need... Cover him, Elara ordered. We're not losing this fight. She turned and charged toward the oncoming wave of Goros soldiers, her pulse rifle firing in quick succession. The Goros were relentless, their glowing eyes fixed on their targets, their weapons sending bursts of deadly energy in return. Elara dove behind a column, narrowly avoiding a blast that would have struck her square in the chest. You will die here, the Goros leader's voice echoed again, growing louder and more insistent. The cradle is invincible. Earth will fall. Nothing can stop the Goros. Elara gritted her teeth. We'll see about that. The Goros close in as if on cue. A loud screech echoed through the chamber, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots on metal. Elara's heart skipped a beat. The Goros had found them. Prepare yourselves, Elara said, her voice firm. We fight until we finish this. No retreat. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and before they could react, the doors to the chamber slammed open, revealing a wave of Goros soldiers, their glowing eyes burning with hatred. Their skeletal forms moved in perfect synchrony, weapons raised, their expressions devoid of mercy. You cannot stop us, the Goros leader's voice rang out, amplified by a strange, ethereal quality. This is the end for you. You cannot defeat the cradle, another Goros soldier hissed. It is beyond your comprehension. Earth will be consumed, just as the others were. Elara's grip tightened around her weapon. She didn't respond to their taunts. There was no time for that now. Every second spent fighting was a second wasted. Fire! Elara shouted. The resistance team opened fire, the sound of gunshots and explosions filling the chamber. The Goro soldiers advanced with terrifying speed, their movements fluid and precise. It was as though they had no fear, no hesitation. They simply were, and they were coming for them. Tessa fired a burst of energy from her rifle, striking one of the soldiers in the chest. But the Goros simply shrugged off the attack, their bodies seemingly impervious to most weapons. The sheer number of them was overwhelming. Elara could see Lucas and Tessa fighting valiantly, but it was clear that the odds were quickly turning against them. "Elara!" Tessa shouted, her voice strained. "We can't hold them off forever." "We don't need to hold them off forever," Elara said, her mind racing. "We just need to buy enough time for the shutdown sequence." She turned to Lucas, who was fighting back-to-back with her, his eyes focused on the control panel. "Can you trigger the shutdown remotely?" she asked. Lucas hesitated for a moment, his fingers dancing over the console in front of him. "I can try," he said, "but it's going to take time to bypass the security protocols. I'll need cover. Cover him," Elara ordered. "We're not losing this fight." She turned and charged toward the oncoming wave of Goros soldiers, her pulse rifle firing in quick succession. The Goros were relentless, their glowing eyes fixed on their targets, their weapons sending bursts of deadly energy in return. Elara dove behind a column, narrowly avoiding a blast that would have struck her square in the chest. "You will die here," the Goros leader's voice echoed again, growing louder and more insistent. "The cradle is invincible. Earth will... Nothing can stop the Goros." Elara gritted her teeth. "We'll see about that." A desperate gamble. The battle raged on as Elara's team fought with everything they had. They were skilled, trained for this exact type of warfare. But even so, the Goros were too many, and their strength was overwhelming. Elara could see that the control panel's lights were flickering erratically, a sure sign that Lucas was struggling to breach the Goros' encryption. "Elara!" Lucas called out, his voice filled with tension. "I'm in, but it's going to take a few more seconds. The system is fighting me every step of the way." "How much longer?" she shouted over the sound of battle. "Maybe 30 seconds, Lucas replied. Elara's eyes darted to the advancing soldiers. 30 seconds wasn't nearly enough time. The Goros were closing in. They couldn't afford to be outnumbered for long. "Stay focused, Lucas," Elara shouted. She turned and opened fire again, her shots hitting the Goro soldiers in rapid succession. But their armor was too thick, and the blasts didn't seem to slow them down. She ducked behind a console, just as a blast of energy seared past her. Sweat was beading on her forehead now, the weight of the moment settling heavily on her. The cradle, the planet's last hope, was only moments away from complete activation. If they didn't succeed, Earth would be lost, consumed by the Goros. Power, swallowed by the very weapon they had been unable to stop. The sound of explosions and blaster fire rang in her ears, a constant reminder of the battle they fought. But Elara's focus remained on the control panel, on Lucas. If they could just hold the line, give him enough time, they might be able to stop the cradle from reaching its full potential. "We will take everything from you," the Goros leader's voice echoed again. "You will die, and your world will be ours." But Elara wasn't listening to their threats anymore. Her focus was sharp, her instincts kicking into overdrive as the battle continued. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the adrenaline surging through her veins, propelling her forward. She had fought this long, fought too hard to give up now. The final countdown. 15 seconds, Lucas called out, his voice strained with effort. "I'm almost there." Elara's heart. Chapter 10. The Shattering of Hope. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal, ozone, and the acrid scent of ionized air. Elara staggered back, her hands up instinctively, her eyes squinting through the blinding light. The blast from the control panel had flooded the chamber with a storm of raw energy, sending shockwaves through the very air they breathed. It felt like the world itself had shuddered, as if the planet was fighting back against the Goros and their machine. For a moment, everything was silent, and then the world began to collapse. The floor cracked beneath Elara's feet, the seams of the chamber splitting open as though the earth itself was being torn apart. The hum of the cradle, which had been a steady presence until now, grew louder, angrier, more insistent. Energy surged through the room, flickering in violent bursts, as the cradle fought against their attempts to disable it. The explosion had only managed to disrupt its core systems, not destroy it. Elara's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to keep her balance. The resistance team was scattered, their bodies battered by the blast. The walls groaned as, under tremendous pressure, and a low rumble echoed through the cavern. "We need to move." Tessa's voice cut through the chaos, a note of urgency in her tone. She was crouched low, her rifle raised, scanning the room. Her eyes darted to Elara. "We've lost the fight on the control panel. We have to get out of here. Now." Elara shook her head. "Not yet. We can't leave until we finish this." But even as she spoke, Elara felt the weight of the situation sink in. The cradle was alive, its systems pulsing with raw energy, but it was not yet fully activated. If the Goros managed to restore its functionality, Earth would be lost. The Topper countdown had already begun, and it was clear now that there was no clean way out of this. "Lucas," Elara shouted, her voice tight with panic. "How much time do we have?" The young hacker was still at the control panel, his fingers flying over the shattered surface as he tried to re-establish a connection. His face was pale, sweat dripping down his brow as he worked with frantic determination. "I'm in," Lucas gasped, "but it's not responding the way it should. The energy's overloading every line of communication. The cradle is fighting back with everything it's got. It's drawing more power from Earth's core than I can handle." Tessa glanced at Elara, her eyes dark with the weight of the decision. "We can't stop it. We have to evacuate." "No." Elara snapped, shaking her head. "We haven't won yet. We've come too far." But the walls shook again, louder this time, and the ground beneath them trembled. Cracks spiderwebbed out from the center of the room as the cradle thrummed louder. The energy in the air growing oppressive, suffocating. The Goros soldiers, who had been temporarily stunned by the explosion, were starting to recover, moving toward the team with deadly intent. Their weapons were raised. "We'll fight our way out if we have to," Elara said through clenched teeth. "But we're finishing this." The Goros soldiers advanced, their eyes burning with cold fury. Elara lifted her weapon, firing in quick succession. The rounds of energy streaked across the room, striking the advancing soldiers with a satisfying hiss of impact. But their armor was thick, reinforced by alien technology, and the shots didn't seem to slow them down. "Elara," Lucas called, his voice rising with panic. "It's not working. The cradle, it's stabilizing. The core's going critical." Elara's heart skipped a beat. "Stabilizing," Tessa echoed, her voice incredulous. "But we just..." Before she could finish, a low, rumbling roar echoed through the chamber, louder than any earthquake. The Goros leader's voice boomed over the high, chaos distorted and filled with disdain. "You cannot stop the inevitable, Elara." The floor cracked wide open, sending debris shooting into the air. The ceiling above them groaned as massive support beams began to buckle. The entire structure was falling apart, piece by piece. The energy from the cradle had destabilized the planet's core, creating a chain reaction that was sending shockwaves through the very foundation of the planet. "The core is going critical," Lucas shouted again, his fingers desperately flying over the shattered console. "The cradle is activating in full. It's drawing all the energy it can from Earth's core. If we don't stop it now, it'll destroy the planet." Elara's mind raced. There was no way they could stop it from here. The core was too deep, the systems too intricate. But they had to find a way. The Goros soldiers were nearly upon them, their weapons raised. They would be on them in seconds. Elara could see the murderous gleam in their eyes, the certainty of their victory. Earth's fate hung in the balance, and the resistance had already failed. "Lucas, do you have anything left?" Elara asked, her voice sharp with urgency. I don't know," Lucas gasped, his fingers trembling as he worked. "I'm not sure what's left, but if we can get close to the cradle's central nexus, I might be able to trigger a massive overload. Tessa's eyes widened. You're talking about destroying the entire planet. Not just the planet, Elara said, voice grim. The cradle is tethered to the planet. It's like a symbiotic relationship. If we destroy it, the planet's core might be saved. It might also destroy everything, Lucas said, his voice full of dread. I can't promise that. Elara didn't hesitate. She turned toward the advancing soldiers and raised her weapon. We don't have a choice. The last desperate charge. The resistance team moved in unison, firing as they ran. The Goro soldiers had closed in completely, their sleek, terrifying figures surrounding them from all sides. It was a full-on assault, a final clash of willpower and survival. Elara led the charge, her movements fluid and purposeful as she shot her way through the enemy ranks. Tessa fought beside her, her rifle unleashing a barrage of firepower, while Lucas followed closely behind, his face set with determination despite the panic that flickered behind his eyes. Get to the Nexus, Elara shouted. Lucas, you have to overload it, now. Lucas, still gasping for air, nodded and sprinted toward the center of the cradle, the epicenter of the power surge. The walls shook violently with every step they took, the Goro soldiers relentless in their pursuit. Elara could feel the heat from the cradle's energy wash over her as they closed the gap. The sound of the Goro's weapons charging in the distance sent a shiver down her spine, but she forced herself to keep moving. There was no retreat now. As they neared the central nexus, Elara saw the enormous structure that housed the cradle's core. It was a massive pillar of swirling energy, a conduit that connected the cradle to the planet's core. It throbbed with unnatural power, a force that was pulling all of Earth's energy into its heart. We're almost there, Lucas shouted, his voice strained with effort. Cover me, I need a minute. Elara spun around, taking aim and firing at the Goro soldiers closing in on them. The sound of blaster fire rang in her ears as the soldiers began to fall. Tessa and Lucas kept moving, but Elara knew they were running out of time. She glanced at Lucas. Do it! Overload it now! Lucas's fingers flew across the panel, his eyes wide with desperation. A sharp whine filled the air, and the cradle's energy flared brightly. Sparks flew from the core as the system began to overload. And then, the ground beneath them began to quake again. The rumbling sound of the cradle's power being siphoned from the core resonated deep in Elara's chest, and she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. This was it, the final gamble. You cannot win, Elara, the Goro's leader's voice echoed, twisted with rage. The cradle cannot be destroyed. But Elara wasn't listening anymore. The countdown began. Chapter 11. The Heart of the Cradle. The room trembled under the intense surge of energy as the cradle's power grew. The deep hum of the core reverberated through every fiber of Elara's body, as if the planet itself was struggling against the might of the weapon that had nearly consumed it. The countdown continued, a deafening noise echoing in her ears, its rhythm like the tolling of a bell, signaling the end of everything. Elara could feel time slipping away like sand through her fingers. Around her, the resistance team fought desperately to hold their ground. The Goro soldiers, relentless in their pursuit, closed in with terrifying efficiency. Their dark, armored forms moved with deadly precision, their weapons glowing with unnatural energy. Every step they took brought them closer to the resistance, team whose position was growing more perilous by the second. Elara! Tessa's voice broke through the noise, urgent and strained. We don't have much time left. Elara's eyes snapped to the center of the room, where Lucas was still at the control panel, his face drawn and pale with the effort. Sweat dripped from his brow as he worked, his fingers flying over the shattered console, his eyes wide with fear. The energy field around the cradle's nexus flickered, unstable, threatening to collapse inward on itself while the Goro soldiers grew ever closer. Lucas, do you have it? Elara shouted, her voice thick with desperation. I'm trying. Lucas yelled back, his voice hoarse with strain. But the system's fighting me every step of the way. I need more time, just a little more. The ground shook beneath them as another blast of energy rippled through the room, a pulse of raw power sent by the cradle itself. The walls groaned as though they were alive, and the air grew hot and thick with static electricity. Elara's heart raced, each beat a reminder that they were running out of time. "Tessa, keep them off me," Lucas shouted, his voice rising with panic. "I need a few more seconds, I swear." Tessa nodded, her face set in determination. "We'll cover. You just keep going." She stepped forward, raising her rifle and letting loose a series of shots that tore through the air. The Goros soldiers advanced with an almost mechanical precision, unfazed by the blasts that hit them. It was as if their bodies were reinforced by the very technology that powered the cradle. They marched forward with no hesitation, their glowing eyes fixed on their target, the destruction of humanity. The sound of their weapons charging up was deafening, and Elara knew that they had to buy Lucas the time he needed. She had no idea how much longer the team could hold them off. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a force they could not hope to overcome directly. Their only chance lay with the cradle, the weapon that was both the key to their salvation and the harbinger of their destruction. Elara moved quickly, darting from cover to cover, shooting as she went. The explosive bursts from her rifle illuminated the room, but it was clear that the Goros were adapting to their tactics. The Goros leader, tall and imposing, moved at the front of the group, his armor gleaming in the light. His eyes, bright, alien and calculating, were fixed on Elara as if he knew that she was the true threat. "You cannot stop what is coming," the Goros leader's voice echoed, cold and implacable. "Earth will fall, just like the others before it. Your struggle is meaningless." Elara gritted her teeth, trying to ignore his taunts. She could hear the hum of the cradle growing louder, the energy surging around them, pressing in like a vice. There was no time for philosophical debates. Only action, only survival. "Cover me," Elara shouted to Tessa and Lucas, her voice sharp. With a nod, Tessa threw herself into the fray, spraying fire at the Goros with deadly accuracy, forcing them to retreat momentarily. The battle raged on in fits and starts, each moment fraught with peril. Lucas was still at the console, his face flushed with exertion. Almost there." His voice was strained, and Elara could see the fear in his eyes. The task he was attempting was monumental, a final, desperate attempt to disable the cradle and prevent its catastrophic activation. "How much longer, Lucas?" Elara shouted, diving into cover as another blast of energy singed the floor near her. "Just a little more," he cried out, sweat pouring down his face. "If I can force this last command sequence, it might be enough. But if it doesn't work, there's no going back." Elara clenched her fists. "Then make it work." The final countdown, the ground beneath them continued to shake. The hum of the cradle now a constant undercurrent, vibrating through the metal walls, through their bones. The countdown clock was ticking faster now, its once calm rhythm now a jagged, staccato beat. The core of the cradle was glowing brighter, its energy building in waves of intensity, like a storm trapped beneath the surface of the planet. Elara's pulse quickened, matching the countdown's pace. Every moment they spent in this room was a moment closer to the destruction of the world they had fought to protect. She knew that no matter what happened, the outcome was going to be catastrophic. But they had to stop it. They had no choice. She turned back to face the Goros leader. The enemy soldiers were advancing once again, relentless in their assault. The leader stood tall and still, as if watching the unfolding chaos with cold amusement. His voice cut through the noise once more. "You think you can win? You are nothing compared to the Goros. We have conquered worlds far beyond your imagination. Earth will fall and you will die." "We'll see about that," Elara spat, her voice steady despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. Her grip on her weapon tightened, and she leapt into the fray once more, firing with lethal precision. Tessa's shots continued to rain down, her hands steady, her focus absolute. She was protecting Lucas. That was all that mattered now. Their survival hinged on him. If they didn't succeed, Earth would be lost. Suddenly, the control panel before Lucas flashed. A burst of light blazed from the panel as the core of the cradle flickered in response. The entire room was illuminated in An eerie green glow, the energy surging wildly as if the cradle itself was reacting to their final efforts. A deafening roar filled the air, and Elara was almost knocked off her feet by the shockwave that reverberated from the center of the room. And then, Lucas's voice rang out, a shout of triumph mixed with raw relief. "I did it!" he screamed. "I triggered the sequence." The walls trembled, and the ground below them buckled as the cradle's systems began to overload. Energy surged in every direction, tearing through the room like a lightning storm, sending sparks flying from the walls. The Goros soldiers faltered, confusion spreading through their ranks as their once dominant weapon began to fail. "We're running out of time," Elara shouted. "Get to the escape pods, now!" But as the team turned to make their way to safety, the cradle's energy rippled outward, crackling like an electrical storm. The energy surge continued to grow, and Elara could feel the temperature rising. The air was thick with the sound of static, a constant hum that reverberated in her ears. The Goros soldiers were stunned, momentarily disoriented, but they quickly regained their composure and began to pursue once more. Elara knew they didn't have much longer. The cradle had been activated, and its destruction would trigger a chain reaction that would tear the planet apart. The only question now was whether they would escape in time, the final sacrifice. As the team sprinted toward the escape pods, the cradle's energy began to pulse more violently. The floor beneath them cracked open, and molten rock began to spill from the seams of the chamber. The temperature continued to rise, and the air became thick with the stench of burning metal. Tessa pushed forward, leading the way, while Lucas stumbled behind, still trying to catch his breath. Elara stayed close, her hand gripping the emergency escape handle as she fought to keep her bearings. Their breaths were ragged, their bodies battered from the battle, but they couldn't stop now. The end was near. "We're almost there," Tessa shouted, her voice strained. "Just a few more steps." But then, a loud crash sounded behind them. The Goros soldiers had regrouped, and they were closing in. Alara's heart pounded in her chest as she turned, raising her weapon once again. The Goros leader was at the front of the group, his eyes blazing with fury. "You cannot run forever," he hissed. "You will all die here." But Elara was done with words. With a fierce cry, she turned to face the oncoming soldiers. "Go!" she shouted at Tessa and Lucas. "I'll hold them off." "No!" Lucas yelled, panic in his voice. "You can't. We need to escape together." But Elara shook her head. "Go. I'll buy you time." Without another word, she turned to face the Goros, ready to fight to the end. Chapter 12. The Final Stand. The walls of the chamber around Elara cracked open like a dying beast. Each tremor sent shockwaves through the floor, deepening the cracks and rupturing the metal and stone. The cradle's heart pulsed with violent energy, its core now unstable, ready to collapse into a supernova of destruction. Elara could feel the heat from the center of the room searing her skin, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Tessa and Lucas were already sprinting toward the escape pods, their figures silhouetted by the blazing light of the cradle's unstable core. Every step Elara took was a race against time, and the enemy closing in behind them. She turned once more to face the oncoming Goros soldiers, who were advancing like a dark tide. The Goros leader, his glowing eyes cold and unyielding, was the front of the line, his face twisted in disdain as he observed the team's desperate scramble for survival. "You cannot run forever," the Goros leader sneered. "The cradle is beyond your understanding. You will not escape." His voice was filled with a chilling certainty, as though he believed in the inevitable. It was true. The destruction of Earth was nearing, but Elara had never been one to accept defeat. Not after everything they had fought for, not after all the lives they had lost. Without hesitation, she turned and fired a shot into the advancing line. The energy beam slammed into one of the soldiers, sending him crashing to the floor, with a metallic clang. But the others did not hesitate, continuing to push forward, unfazed by the initial resistance. Elara's pulse was like thunder in her ears. She could feel the energy of the cradle building with every passing second. The countdown on the side of the chamber was a flashing reminder that they had mere minutes, if not seconds, before the planet would be torn apart. "Go, Elara!" Tessa shouted from a distance, her voice cutting through the chaos. Elara looked over her shoulder. She could see Lucas clinging to the escape pod's control panel, his face strained with concentration, trying to initiate the sequence to launch. Tessa had already climbed into the pod, her rifle raised, covering the rear as best as she could. But Elara knew that if she didn't slow the Goros down, there would be no escape for anyone. "I'll hold them off," she yelled back, her voice barely audible over the rising hum of the cradle. "You are wasting your time," the Goros leader said coldly. His voice rang out, reverberating off the walls. "Earth is already lost. You are just delaying the inevitable." Elara's grip tightened around her weapon, and without another word, she turned to face the advancing soldiers. She fired again, this time aiming for their weak points, their joints, the exposed spots in their armor where the energy shields were thin. One soldier fell with a screech of metal, but the others pressed on, their armor shimmering with the telltale glow of energy shields. They had been augmented for this. They were prepared to die for the cradle. But Elara had no intention of going down without a fight. She darted to the side, weaving between the pillars of debris that had once been the room's sturdy walls. Her feet moved with practiced precision, each step a calculated evasion of the incoming fire. Her mind was laser-focused on the objective: buy as much time as possible for her team to escape. The Goros soldiers were relentless, their weapons charging up, ready to unleash another barrage. But Elara was faster. She took cover behind a column and watched them, waiting for the perfect moment. She could hear the static charge in the air, the hum of weapons priming. As one of the soldiers stepped into her line of sight, she fired again, hitting him square in the chest. His armor flared, briefly crackling with energy before he crumpled to the floor. One down. But there were more coming, behind her. The cradle thrummed louder, and Elara knew that the energy surge was reaching its critical peak. She could feel the heat pressing in, the ground trembling underfoot. The countdown, loud and ominous, echoed through the chamber, its rhythm a constant reminder that this was it, the final moments of Earth's existence. Elara turned and sprinted to the other side of the room, using the chaos to her advantage. She fired a few more rounds as she moved, watching the Goros soldiers struggle to track her movements. The leader was still standing at the front of the group, his expression unchanged, watching her with cold contempt. But Elara wasn't focused on him anymore. She reached the far wall where the escape pods were waiting. Tessa and Lucas were already inside, the doors sealed tight. The pods were small, designed to carry a handful of survivors to safety, if there was any safety left to be found. Elara knew that this was her last chance. The Goros leader's expression remained unchanged as he raised his hand, signaling the soldiers to advance once more. Elara turned to face him one last time, her weapon still in hand. She took a deep breath, steadying her pulse, and raised her rifle. It felt like the weight of the world was in her hands. Every inch of the planet, every life she had fought for, every soul she had sworn to protect, was on her shoulders. Her weapon hummed as she aimed directly at the Goros leader. He didn't flinch, didn't move. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling calmness, as though he knew that in the end he would win. "You will die here," he said again, his voice as cold as ice. "And Earth will fall." Elara's heart pounded, but her resolve never wavered. This was her fight, this was her moment to make a difference, and she would not back down. "I don't think so," Elara muttered under her breath. "Not today." She fired. The shot rang out, the energy beam slicing through the air like a spear. It hit the Goros leader dead center, but instead of falling, he staggered back. His armor flared, crackling with energy, but it did not break. He looked at her, a slow smile creeping across his face. "You think your weapons can stop me?" he taunted. "I am beyond you." Elara's blood ran cold as the leader raised his hand, a pulse of energy emanating from his palm. The shockwave hit her like a freight train, sending her flying across the room, her weapon flying from her hands. She slammed into the floor, her body aching from the impact. Through the haze, Elara saw Tessa and Lucas in the escape pod, looking at her with wide eyes. Tessa was shouting something, but the sound was muffled in her ears. The countdown on the cradle had reached its final seconds. Elara could feel the heat building around her, the energy surging through the walls. If the Goro's leader wasn't stopped, the planet would be lost. With all the strength she had left, Elara pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking from the effort. The world spun around her, but she forced herself to stay focused. She had to end this. Her eyes locked on the leader once more. He was walking toward her slowly, his footsteps steady and unhurried. "You are nothing," he said again, his voice dripping with disdain. Elara gritted her teeth. "I am everything." She staggered to the control panel in the center of the room, the one that had activated the cradle's core. With shaky hands, she activated the emergency override. The console blinked once, then twice, and finally flared to life. The final sequence triggered. A piercing alarm rang out, louder than the explosion itself, signaling that the cradle's destruction was imminent. The Goro's leader's eyes widened in disbelief. "No," he snarled. "You cannot." But Elara's lips curled into a defiant smile. "You lost," she said. The explosion that followed was deafening. The room erupted in a cascade of fire and light. Elara felt her body being thrown backward once more. But this time, she didn't fight it. She let the darkness take her, knowing that the fight was over, that Earth had a chance, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to close her eyes. Chapter 13. The Aftermath. The world was a blur of fire, chaos, and blinding light. The explosion from the cradle tore through the very fabric of reality, a devastating shockwave that sent the chamber crumbling into dust. Elara's body was hurled backward, her vision blacking out as the force of the blast knocked her unconscious. The last thing she felt was the searing heat, and then nothing. Hours later, when Elara awoke, it was to silence, the kind of silence that wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket, eerily still, almost unnatural in its depth. Her eyes opened to the sight of shattered stone and twisted metal. The room, once a symbol of mankind's greatest threat, was now a ruin. The cradle's core, its pulsating heart, had imploded, its energy dissipating into the void, leaving behind nothing but broken remnants of the machine that had nearly destroyed them all. She gasped, her breath shallow at first as she tried to assess her surroundings. Her body ached, bruised from the impact, but miraculously she was alive. She sat up slowly, wincing as pain shot through her limbs. The air around her was thick with dust, and the once glowing lights now flickered weakly, like dying embers. "Tessa? Lucas?" Elara's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. The silence answered her. With a shaking hand, she pushed herself to her feet, her gaze scanning the wreckage. She could see nothing but destruction. The walls were shattered, the floor cracked open, and the ceiling above had partially collapsed, blocking off any exit. It was as if the entire structure had been swallowed by the very earth it stood upon. She staggered forward, her steps uncertain. Her head spun, but she pushed through it, fighting the dizziness that threatened to pull her back into unconsciousness. She needed to find Tessa and Lucas. They couldn't be far. They couldn't have... A groan cut through the air. Elara froze. "Tessa!" she called out, more urgently now, her heart racing. There was another sound, a cough followed by a soft whimper. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She ran toward the source of the sound, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible. "Tessa!" she called again, this time with a force that seemed to echo in the empty chamber. She rounded a corner of fallen debris and found her friend, collapsed against a twisted piece of metal. Her face was pale, blood smeared across her forehead, her clothes torn and dirty. But her eyes, thankfully, were open, and she was alive. "Tessa, are you okay?" Elara's voice was trembling now, a mix of relief and fear. Tessa's eyes flickered as she struggled to focus on Elara. A weak smile tugged at her lips, though it was clear she was in pain. "I think I think I'll live, Tessa muttered, her voice rasping. She tried to sit up but winced as pain shot through her side. What happened? Where's Lucas? Elara's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Lucas. She scanned the wreckage, her pulse quickening. She could feel the panic rising in her chest. He should be here. We need to find him. We have to make sure he's okay. Tessa nodded, weakly, but didn't argue. She understood the urgency. The Goros leader had been killed by the blast, but the aftermath was still chaotic. They had to escape the cradle's collapsing remains before it was too late. Elara helped Tessa to her feet, supporting her as she staggered to the nearest wall. Her friend's condition was grim. She was clearly hurt, and they didn't have the luxury of time to heal her wounds. But they couldn't stay in the crumbling ruins. Elara, what happened to the cradle? Tessa asked, her voice barely audible. Did we stop it? Elara's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening as the memory of the final moments before the explosion surged to the forefront of her mind. We stopped it, she said firmly, but at a cost. The Goros, Tessa whispered, her eyes wide. They're gone, aren't they? Elara nodded, but there was no joy in her face. They're gone. The cradle collapsed, but I don't know how much time we have before she could finish her sentence. A loud rumble shook the ground beneath them. The walls groaned, as though they were alive, and the very structure seemed to tremble in response to something far more dangerous than any of them could comprehend. Elara, we need to go, Tessa urged, panic creeping into her voice. Now. Before Elara could respond, she heard a faint sound, soft at first, then growing louder, the unmistakable hum of the escape pods. Her heart leaped into her throat. Elara. Tessa, can you hear me? Lucas's voice crackled over the communicator embedded in Elara's suit. Lucas! Elara shouted, her voice breaking through the static. Where are you? What's happening? I'm still here, Lucas replied, his voice weak. I managed to trigger the pod's emergency protocol. I'm on the surface. Get to the launch bay. Now. The Goros may have been defeated, but there's still one more thing we need to deal with. Elara's heart sank. One more thing. She glanced at Tessa, whose face was pale, sweat beading on her forehead as the weight of their situation began to sink in. Let's go, Elara said, helping Tessa limp forward, her body screaming in protest. With every step, the walls around them continued to shake as the structure seemed to groan in protest, as if it was struggling to hold itself together. The hallway ahead was filled with debris, but they had no choice but to press on. The escape pods were their only chance. Minutes later, Elara and Tessa finally reached the launch bay. The doors, once sealed tight, now hung ajar, the control systems sparking intermittently. The air inside was thick with dust, and the dim emergency lights cast eerie shadows over the space. But there, standing at the center of the room, looking just as battered as they were, was Lucas, Elara, Tessa. Lucas's voice was barely a whisper, but his eyes were filled with relief as he spotted them. Thank God you're both alive. We made it, Elara said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. What now? What's this one more thing we need to deal with? Lucas swallowed hard, his face drawn with fatigue. The cradle wasn't just a weapon. It was a gateway. When it activated, it sent out a distress signal. We're not the only ones who knew about it. Elara's brow furrowed. You mean, there's more of them? Lucas nodded grimly. Yes, the cradle didn't just collapse, it called them here. The Goros are gone, but their empire is vast, and now they know we exist. A loud explosion rocked the ground beneath them, sending the three of them sprawling to the floor. The launch bay doors blew open, and a new threat emerged. Massive ships, dark and ominous, filling the sky above. The battle for Earth was far from over. Chapter 14. A New Dawn. The sky above Earth had never looked so ominous. It wasn't just the darkness, although that in itself felt unnatural, like a cold, oppressive weight hanging over everything. It wasn't just the ships, vast and sprawling, whose silhouettes blotted out the stars. It wasn't even the knowledge that the Goros Empire, though defeated, had only been a small part of a much larger galaxy-spanning force. No, what made the Earth's fate feel even more uncertain was the reality of what was coming next. A shadow had descended upon humanity, a shadow that was far older, far darker, and far more powerful than anything the Goros could have ever been. Elara, do you see this? Lucas's voice broke through her reverie, his tone strained. He stood at the observation window in the launch bay, his eyes fixed on the blackened sky above. His hands gripped the sides of the console with such force that his knuckles were white. Elara joined him, her gaze lifting to the heavens. The ships above were unlike anything she had ever seen before. They weren't like the sleek, menacing Goros warships. These were ancient-looking, massive, and almost organic in design, with surfaces that seemed to ripple as though they were alive. The darkness around them appeared to grow, seeping into the very fabric of space. They were closing in fast. "They're here," Tessa muttered from the doorway. Her voice, though weak from the injuries she sustained earlier, carried a note of grave certainty. Elara felt the weight of those words settle heavily over her chest. "How long do we have?" "Not long enough," Lucas replied, his voice tight. "They're already sending out landing craft. The fleet is too large to fight with what we have left." Elara's mind raced. There was so much they still didn't know. Who were these new invaders? Where did they come from? And what did they want with Earth? The answer came in a way that none of them could have anticipated. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a deep, resonating hum, so intense that it vibrated through the walls of the launch bay. The hum grew louder, growing into a deep, bone-rattling vibration that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. The ship that had led the invasion began to pulse with a fiery energy, and from its belly emerged a single enormous figure, slowly descending to the planet's surface. Elara watched in shock as the figure touched down on the ground, its feet causing the Earth to quake under the immense pressure. It was humanoid, towering far above even the largest Goros, its form clad in dark, gleaming armor. The air seemed to distort around it, as if reality itself was bending in response to its presence. Tessa, standing next to Elara, gasped. "What in the hell is that?" Elara didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the towering figure, a sense of dread creeping through her spine. She had never seen anything like it before. The figure moved with a slow, deliberate pace, its head swiveling left and right as if scanning the ruined city around them. "That is no Goros," Lucas said, his voice low with disbelief. "That's something else." It was then that they heard it, an almost imperceptible whisper like a hiss on the wind. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was more of a sensation, a thought that slipped through their minds as easily as if it had always been there. "Earth will bow. All will serve the void." The words struck Elara like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart skipped a beat. She stumbled back, almost falling over the control panel behind her. The voice was inside her mind, and the message was chilling. It's telepathic?" Tessa whispered, her voice trembling. Elara nodded grimly. "Yes." The massive figure raised its arm, and a beam of violet light shot from its hand, slicing through the air. The beam hit the ground with a deafening explosion, sending debris flying in all directions. But the blast wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed at the city in the distance, at the heart of civilization itself. The beam tore through buildings with terrifying ease, reducing them to rubble in a matter of moments. "Elara," Lucas said urgently, "we can't fight that thing. We need to get out of here, now." Elara shook her head, a cold determination settling over her. "We don't have time. If we leave now, they'll finish the job before we have a chance to stop them." The towering figure turned, its head slowly tilting as if acknowledging their presence. The violet energy continued to hum around it, and Elara felt the oppressive weight of its power pressing down on her like a storm. Suddenly, a deep guttural voice broke the eerie silence. I am Orphan, commander of the Void Legion. You are nothing. In the face of the void. Surrender now, and your suffering will be swift. Elara felt her pulse quicken, her breath shallow as she stood before the living manifestation of death. Orphan. The name resonated through her mind like a prophecy, and omen of things to come. She could feel the presence of the void itself, lurking just behind him, ready to devour all that humanity had fought for. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but even she knew this was far beyond anything she could hope to defeat. Still, she refused to bow. No, she said, her voice firm despite the fear curling in her gut. We will never bow to you, we will fight. Orphan's eyes locked onto hers, and she could feel the cold weight of his gaze press down upon her, an overwhelming force that sought to crush her will. But she held her ground, staring into his void-like eyes. She couldn't let fear take over. Not now. So be it, he intoned, his voice a low, thunderous growl. The void shall consume all, but your resistance will only hasten the end. With that, Orphan raised his arm again, sending another surge of violet energy through the air. This time it wasn't aimed at the city, it was aimed directly at them. The blast of energy tore through the bay, scattering debris in all directions, and sending Elara, Tessa, and Lucas hurtling backward, crashing into the ground with violent force. Get up, Lucas yelled, his voice strained with urgency. We need to move now! Tessa managed to scramble to her feet first, helping Lucas up as Elara did the same. They had no time to waste. Orphan was closing in, and his next move could very well be their last. Elara, Lucas gasped. We have to find a way to fight back. That thing, he's too powerful. I know, Elara replied, her heart racing. Her mind was working furiously, but the options were few. They couldn't take on Orphan head-to-head. They needed to outsmart him, to find a way to disrupt whatever power source he controlled. Her eyes darted to the escape pod controls behind them. There were still small escape vehicles left, enough to carry them away. But those vehicles were not designed to fight. Not like this. Then it hit her. The cradle had collapsed, but the technology it housed wasn't completely destroyed. Some of the energy reserves, some of the tech that powered the Goro's war machines, could still be repurposed. It was a long shot, a slim chance, but it was their only shot. We need to get to the cradle's control center, she said, a spark of determination lighting her eyes. The Goros may be gone, but their tech is still here. If we can tap into it, we can build something that can fight back. We don't have much time, Tessa said, glancing back at the towering figure of Orphan who was now advancing toward them, his footsteps shaking the ground with each movement. No time to waste, Elara said grimly. Let's move. Chapter 15. The Cradle's Secret. The air was thick with tension, as if the very atmosphere around them had been charged with the energy of an impending storm. Orphan's immense form loomed on the horizon, casting a shadow over everything. His every step reverberated through the ground, making the world feel as if it was teetering on the edge of collapse. Elara's heart raced, her pulse thundering in her ears as she glanced at Tessa and Lucas. They knew they didn't have much time. If they didn't act now, Orphan and his forces would destroy everything. The city, the people, the very heart of Earth itself. Elara. How are we going to survive this? Tessa asked, her voice strained but determined. She was still limping slightly, her side hurting from the earlier blast, but there was a fire in her eyes, a refusal to give up. I don't know, Elara replied, her voice low. But we have to try. If we can get to the cradle's control center, maybe we can use what's left of the Goros technology to fight back. Lucas, who had been silent up until now, nodded, his eyes hard with resolve. We don't have a choice. If we wait here, we die. We fight, or we don't survive. Elara glanced at the control panels behind them. They could hear Orphan's movements now, the slow, deliberate thudding of his steps drawing closer with every passing moment. The sound was like the approach of doom itself. All right, Elara said, her voice steady now, her mind sharpening with purpose. We move quickly. Head for the cradle's core. It's our only shot. With no time to lose, the trio moved as quickly as they could, weaving through the wreckage of the launch bay. The walls around them were shaking violently with each step of Orphan, the very foundation of the facility threatening to crumble. They made their way through the darkened halls, navigating the maze-like corridors that once served as the heart of the Goros' operations. The lights were flickering, casting long, eerie shadows over the walls. The once sterile, high-tech environment now felt like a tomb, a place where humanity's last hope was slowly dying. "Elara," Lucas said, breaking the silence. "Do you think we can really do this? I mean, the cradle was destroyed. All that remains is debris." "I don't know," she admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. "But there was a lot more to the cradle than we understood. It was a weapon, yes, but it was also a conduit. The Goros didn't just use it for war, they used it to draw energy from the very core of the planet. If we can tap into whatever's left, maybe we can harness that energy and use it against Orphan." "Orphan." Tessa said his name like a curse, the weight of it hanging in the air like a thick fog. "I can't believe this is happening. I thought the Goros were the worst we'd face." "I thought so too," Elara muttered. "But the Goros were just the beginning. We don't know how deep the void runs, how many more of them are out there." The thought was enough to chill her blood. It wasn't just Earth at risk now. This invasion was part of something far larger, a cosmic force that had already stretched its tendrils across countless worlds, erasing civilizations in its wake. They had faced the Goros, but they were merely pawns in a much grander game. With that thought gnawing at the back of her mind, Elara led them down another corridor. They were getting closer to the cradle's core, where the heart of the technology lay. They had to make it there before the facility collapsed completely. Minutes later, the control room was eerily silent when they arrived. The monitors were dark, save for the occasional flicker of static. The central console, once a shining beacon of power and control, was now little more than a charred skeleton. The walls around them had been gutted by the explosion that had brought down the cradle, and the air smelled of burnt metal and scorched circuitry. "This is it," Elara said, standing before the central control panel. "The cradle's core should be beneath us, but we need to get through this mess first." Lucas knelt beside the console, his hands moving swiftly as he tried to access whatever systems remained. "There's a backup system," he muttered, "but it's not responding. If we're going to get any power from this place, we'll have to bypass the main circuits." Elara's gaze drifted around the room, her mind calculating their next move. "Do it. Whatever you have to do, Lucas. Just get us something." He nodded grimly and set to work, his fingers flying over the damaged console. Sparks flew occasionally as he forced his way through the system's defenses. Tessa stood by, keeping a wary eye on the door. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not with Orphan closing in on them. Minutes felt like hours as Lucas worked, the tension building with each passing second. Finally, he let out a breath, and the lights flickered back to life, dim but enough to see by. The hum of the machinery came to life, faint but steady. "We've got power," Lucas said, his voice laced with relief. "But I can't access the full database. I'll need to manually trigger the core." "Do it," Elara said, her voice sharp. "We don't have time." With a final keystroke, Lucas activated a sequence that sent the entire facility into a low-frequency vibration. The floor beneath them groaned, and the walls seemed to shake as energy began to surge through the structure once more. The room's monitors lit up, displaying cryptic data streams. Readouts Elara could barely comprehend, but they confirmed what she feared. "This is it," Lucas said, his voice shaking with exhaustion. "The energy's stabilizing, but it's going to be unstable. If we try to use this energy, we'll have to release it quickly before it overloads." "Then let's not waste any more time," Elara replied, her jaw set in determination. "We've got one shot at this. We take down Orphan and his fleet, or we die trying." Suddenly a voice boomed from above. It wasn't Orphan, but the dark energy of the void itself seemed to echo through the very walls. "You cannot stop the void. Earth will be consumed. All will serve the endless dark. Elara's breath caught in her throat. Not today, she muttered, clutching the control panel tightly. Not today. The control core A's. Lucas worked furiously at the console. Elara and Tessa looked out through the shattered windows of the control room, gazing at the terrifying fleet in the distance. Orphan's ship hovered above the surface, its dark form consuming the sky. But beneath them, a deep rumble began to resonate through the cradle. The core, unstable as it was, had awakened. Its energy surged, radiating outward like a pulse through the facility. Elara could feel it, like a force of nature, wild and untamable. It was the key to their survival. Lucas's voice broke through her thoughts. We're ready. Elara, we need to channel this energy through the main conduits and fire it at their fleet. It's our only shot. Elara didn't hesitate. Then let's do it. We won't get another chance. With a final motion, Lucas activated the sequence. The room lit up with blinding light as energy surged through the control systems, and Elara knew that they were about to make their stand. Chapter 16. The Pulse of Resistance. The hum of the cradle's core was deafening, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to resonate not just in the walls around them but deep within their bones. Elara's pulse quickened, matching the erratic rhythm of the energy coursing through the facility's systems. The power was surging again, ready to unleash, but there was a sense of urgency now. The energy would only hold for so long before it overloaded, consuming everything in its path. Can you stabilize it, Lucas? Elara asked, her voice strained, her eyes fixed on the chaotic data flashing across the nearby monitor. Her mind was racing as she calculated their next steps. Orphan was still above them, the Void Legion fleet looming ever closer. They had one chance, one shot, to stop them. Lucas was hunched over the console, sweat trickling down his face as he worked furiously to adjust the controls. It's stable, but barely. If we don't release the energy now, it'll blow us all to hell. Then we don't wait, Elara said sharply. She turned to Tessa, who was standing by the shattered window, watching the fleet below. The invasion was in full swing now. The sky was filled with ships, their dark forms blotting out the stars. The city had already begun to crumble under the weight of the Void's presence. Time was running out. Tessa turned to Elara, her face grim. We're going to do this, aren't we? Elara met her gaze, her expression determined. We don't have a choice. We fight back or we're finished. The tension in the room was palpable as Lucas finished inputting the last sequence. The cradle's core pulsed with an ominous energy, the power of the Goro's technology ready to be unleashed. Lucas wiped his brow, standing up straight, and gave Elara a nod. It's all set. You're in control now. Elara stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her, the enormity of what they were about to do. The energy that the Goros had harnessed from the planet's core was volatile, unpredictable. If they miscalculated, if they couldn't control, they would destroy themselves along with everything else. But there was no going back now. With a steadying breath, Elara placed her hands on the control panel. The glowing symbols on the screen shifted, forming a new sequence. She input the final command, initiating the discharge of energy. The room seemed to tremble, the floor beneath their feet vibrating as the power built. Outside, the sky darkened. Even further, the ships above them moving in unison, closing in on the final strike. Elara's fingers hovered over the final button. They could feel the energy pulsing, growing stronger, more intense with each passing second. Every molecule of her being screamed to hesitate, to pull back, to find another way. But there was no time. Here we go, she whispered. She pressed the button. The release. The cradle's core erupted with a roar of power. Energy cascaded outward in a blinding burst, radiating through the facility's conduits like lightning. And then, silence. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The lights flickered and the ground beneath them seemed to hold its breath. And then, with a deafening crack, the power was unleashed, A beam of violet energy shot from the cradle, cutting through the sky like a sword. It shot upward, towards the fleet of Void Legion ships that hovered ominously overhead. The beam cracked the atmosphere, surging into the void beyond, a massive, concentrated blast of destructive energy. For a long moment, nothing happened, and then an explosion. The beam struck the lead ship of the Void Legion with a force so powerful that it tore through the hull, sending a shockwave across the sky. The ship exploded in a massive fireball, its fragments scattering in all directions. The rest of the fleet seemed to stagger, caught off guard by the sudden assault. Another blast followed, then another, as the cradle continued to pulse with energy, each pulse a destructive force that tore through the invaders' ships. Elara watched in disbelief as the Void Legion's ships began to break apart. The energy beam was working. It was working. But even as their enemies' forces crumbled, Elara knew that the real battle was far from over. "We're not done yet," Lucas said, his voice laced with awe as he watched the devastation unfold. "This is just the beginning. We need to move fast," Elara said. "Orphan is still out there. The pulse won't last forever." As if on cue, a voice echoed through the facility, deep and resonating. The power of the Void Legion's leader reached out like a tendril, filling the room with its dark presence. "Foolish mortals," Orphan's voice boomed. "You dare to strike at the void? Your resistance is meaningless. The darkness will consume you all." Elara's blood ran cold. She could feel his presence, that unnatural, suffocating weight pressing down upon them. It was as if the very air had turned to stone. "We need to finish this now," Tessa said urgently, her eyes scanning the readings on the monitors. "Orphan's coming," Elara nodded. They couldn't wait any longer. The Void Legion was reeling from the attack, but Orphan, he was the true threat. They had to take him down or Earth would be lost. The final confrontation. They made their way out of the control room, the corridors still shaking with the aftershocks of the cradle's discharge. The floor was scorched, the walls cracked, but they had no time to marvel at the destruction. Ahead, Orphan's massive form was already descending, his dark figure filling the doorway at the end of the hallway. The very air seemed to ripple around him, and the temperature in the room dropped, as if the void was beginning to seep into reality itself. Elara clenched her fists. They had only one shot at this. "Orphan," she called out, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. "This ends now." Orphan's glowing violet eyes fixed on her, and a low, ominous laugh rumbled from within his chest. "You think you can stop me?" The energy of the cradle still pulsed in the air around them, and Elara could feel its power vibrating through her very being. She knew that this was their only chance. If she could just get close enough, if she could direct the remaining power, from the cradle, they might be able to turn the tide. Orphan's form shifted, his hand raising as if to strike, and Elara felt the air crackle with the intensity of his power. She acted without thinking, her body moving on instinct. She charged, sprinting toward him with everything she had, her mind locked on the final moment. "You will bow before the void," Orphan bellowed, his voice sending ripples through the air. But Elara wasn't listening. She was already there. In a blur of motion, she reached out, her hand slamming against the panel near the cradle's control station. The energy flared, surging from the facility, straight into the heart of the Void Legion's commander. Orphan staggered back, a look of surprise crossing his features as the energy from the cradle enveloped him. The darkness around him writhed and shrieked as the power of the Goros technology clashed with his own, creating a violent explosion of force. The ground beneath them cracked open as the two forces collided. For a brief moment, there was nothing but chaos. Then, as the smoke began to clear, Elara found herself on her knees, gasping for breath. The energy from the cradle was gone, used up in that final moment of reckoning. But Orphan, the towering figure of darkness, was nowhere to be seen. Elara's heart raced. They had done it. They had finally done it. We did it, Lucas said, his voice filled with awe. "We stopped him," but Elara's eyes were scanning the horizon. Though Orphan was gone, she could feel it. The shadow of the void was still there, lingering, watching. This was only one battle in a much larger war, and Earth was far from safe. Chapter 17. The Shattered Horizon. The cradle stood still in the aftermath of the battle. The once thriving hub of ancient technology now lay in ruins, its systems all but spent. But there was a quiet calm in the air, unnatural, like the stillness after a storm when the clouds have parted, but the thunder still rumbles in the distance. Elara stood amidst the debris, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had never been one for easy victories, but this felt different. Orphan, the leader of the Void Legion, was gone. The dark shadow that had loomed over the world for so long had finally lifted. But even as the adrenaline coursed through her veins, she could feel the nagging doubt at the back of her mind. Something was wrong. Tessa was kneeling beside her, examining the remnants of the cradle's systems. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with uncertainty. Elara shook her head. "I don't think so." Lucas approached, his face drawn with exhaustion. "What do you mean?" Elara paused, her eyes scanning the horizon where the Void Legion fleet had once hovered. The sky was clear now, but the air still felt heavy, like the world had been cracked open, and the pieces were slowly drifting back together. The destruction they had caused was immense, and the energy released had ripped through the fleet with enough force to level entire mountains. But Orphan, the ID, being of unimaginable power, had been destroyed. For a moment, Elara allowed herself a breath of relief, but she knew deep down that this wasn't over. "I don't feel it," she said, almost as if speaking to herself. "The void, it's still there. Something is out of balance." Lucas frowned, glancing around. "What do you mean?" "Orphan is gone. The fleet's destroyed. The cradle's power has been released. This should be over." "It should be over," Elara said, her voice firm. "But I'm telling you, I can still feel it. It's like a presence hanging over us, watching us, waiting." Tessa stood up, brushing off the dust and debris from her clothes. "What are we supposed to do now, Elara? Orphan's dead and the fleet's gone. What's left to fight?" Elara turned toward her, her face grim. "I don't know, but we need to get to the heart of this. Whatever it is, it's not finished. The void, it's not just one being. Orphan was only a part of something much larger." Lucas's expression darkened as he looked out across the landscape, the remains of the battle strewn out before them. "Do you think there's more of them? More leaders, more legions?" Elara nodded. "I don't know for sure, but that's what I'm afraid of. Orphan might have been the leader of this particular invasion, but if he's part of a larger network, there could be more of them out there waiting to strike." Tessa looked at her, her eyes narrowing. "Then we need to find out what's going on. We need to figure out where they came from and how to stop them for good." Elara bit her lip, weighing their options. The task ahead of them seemed insurmountable, yet they had come so far. Orphan had been defeated, but the true nature of the Void Legion remained shrouded in mystery. "First, we need to assess the damage," Elara said finally. "We'll need to find out if any of the Goro's technology survived. There could be something left that can help us figure out how to stop this for good." Hours later, the team moved through the wreckage of the Cradle facility, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The once bustling technological marvel had been reduced to a graveyard of twisted metal, scorched walls, and shattered glass. The energy surges from the Cradle's core had sent shockwaves throughout the region, leveling much of the surrounding city. Now it felt like the calm before an even greater storm. Elara stopped in front of a series of charred control panels, her fingers brushing against the remnants of a destroyed databank. Lucas and Tessa were nearby, sorting through piles of broken equipment, but Elara's mind was elsewhere. The pulse of the void, the presence she had sensed, was still haunting her. It was faint, like a distant whisper, but it was there, growing stronger with every passing second. "Elara, come over here," Lucas called out. He was standing next to a partially intact console, its lights flickering weakly. It was a relic of Goro's technology, and if it still functioned, it could provide the answers they needed. Elara hurried over to Lucas, her boots crunching on the shattered debris. She crouched next to him, examining the console as he worked to access the power grid. With a few swift keystrokes, Lucas brought up a series of encrypted files. The screen was filled with symbols and data streams that Elara couldn't immediately decipher, but one thing was clear. These weren't typical Goros files. Lucas hesitated, his fingers dancing over the keys, trying to make sense of the data. This isn't just about the Cradle or the Void Legion. It's about something else. What are you saying? Elara asked, her voice tinged with urgency. Lucas scrolled through the files, his eyes widening as he pieced together the information. This is a map, a network of void energy sources spread across the galaxy. This isn't just one invasion. It's a coordinated attack, a galactic scale campaign. Orphan's fleet was just one front. Elara's heart skipped a beat. So this isn't over, not even close. No, Lucas confirmed, his voice grim. Orphan was a general in a much larger war. He was just one piece of a massive force that's been consuming worlds. Tessa leaned over, squinting at the data. So what do we do now? We can't fight something that big. We find out where it's coming from, Elara said, her mind already working through the possibilities. We find the heart of the void and cut it out. Do you have a plan for that? Tessa asked skeptically. I have a theory, Elara said, her tone determined. The Goros technology may be the key to accessing whatever remains of the Void's network. If we can tap into the deep space relays, we might be able to track down their home base. And then what? Lucas asked, his brow furrowing. We end this war before it even reaches Earth. The journey begins. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. They had to prepare for the long journey ahead, one that would take them far beyond Earth's orbit. The Void Legion, though decimated, was far from defeated. Orphan's death had created a power vacuum, but Elara suspected that this was part of a much larger campaign. The galaxy was at war, and Earth had just been caught in the middle. Lucas, Tessa, and Elara worked together, combing through the Goros technology they had salvaged. They pieced together fragments of data and schematics, and after long hours of deciphering and testing, they managed to repair an old deep space relay system. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Elara stared at the glowing holographic map of the galaxy as the relay hummed to life. It was a vast, incomprehensible expanse of stars and unknown worlds, and somewhere in the depths of that darkness, the heart of the Void Legion awaited. They were going to find it and destroy it before it could reach Earth. But even as they made preparations, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The lingering presence of the Void remained, a constant pressure. On her mind, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as they set their course for the heart of the Void, Elara knew they were about to face a challenge unlike any they had ever known. The relay's days turned into weeks as the team traveled through the vast expanse of space. The stars outside the ship's window became nothing more than distant points of light, each one a potential target. The deep space relays had revealed something far more terrifying than they had expected. The Void wasn't just one alien species. It was a network of civilizations, a collective of forces that spanned the galaxy, and they were coming. One by one, they passed through several waypoints, hidden stations left behind by the Goros, relics of an ancient war that had been fought in the shadows of the universe. But each station they encountered only brought more questions. There were signs that other races had fought back against the Void, but all had failed. Every civilization had fallen, wiped from the map of the galaxy. The team finally arrived at the edge of the Void's territory, a cold, desolate expanse of space that seemed to pulse with dark energy. The ship's sensors flickered erratically as they approached, the gravitational pull of the Void's heart causing strange anomalies in their systems. We're almost there, Lucas said, looking at the readouts. This is it. Whatever's left of the Void Legion is here. Tessa stood next to him, her hand resting on the console. Let's make it count. Elara took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come. They had come so far, and yet the true battle was only just beginning. Chapter 18. Into the abyss, the void of space was vast, and Elara had often found herself captivated by its silence, its eerie stillness that stretched on forever. Yet, as the ship drew closer to the void's heart, the tranquility of the stars began to shift. It was as if the universe itself had grown colder, the light around them dulled, the blackness of space thickening like ink seeping into water. The sensors were spiking erratically, and the ship's controls were increasingly difficult to manage. Gravity wells, unseen forces were pulling at the ship, disrupting their navigation systems, and every second felt like a descent into some unfathomable abyss. This place. It feels wrong, Tessa said, her voice low, betraying the unease that had begun to seep into her as well. Elara stood at the front of the bridge, hands gripping the console as she stared into the darkness ahead. Her senses screamed at her, warning her that they were walking into the mouth of something much older, much more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The void wasn't just an enemy. It was a pervasive force, like a shadow that consumed light and life alike. "How far are we from the core?" Elara asked, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. She had always prided herself on maintaining control, but now that they were on the brink of facing the Void Legion's true heart, she could feel the weight of their mission, pressing down on her. "Not far," Lucas replied from behind her, his voice taut with concentration. "We're entering the core's outermost defense zone. The readings are off the charts, gravity distortions, energy spikes. If we keep heading straight, we'll be pulled into whatever gravity well is at the center of all this. We need to adjust our course or we'll be crushed." "Do it," Elara said, her jaw tightening. "We can't afford to stop now." Lucas adjusted the ship's trajectory, expertly guiding them away from the gravitational pull that threatened to drag them into oblivion. Still, the pull seemed relentless, and as they moved deeper into the void's heart, the silence around them became unbearable. "Do you feel it?" Tessa whispered, her eyes wide, scanning the readings. Something. Before she could finish, the ship shook violently. The lights flickered and alarms blared, their shrill sounds reverberating throughout the hull. The floor beneath them vibrated with an unsettling resonance, like the pulse of something ancient and powerful. "Brace yourselves," Elara shouted, her instincts kicking in as she grabbed onto the nearest console for support. The ship lurched again, this time with a force that sent them all stumbling. Elara's heart raced as she tried to maintain her footing, her eyes darting to the control panels. The ship was being torn apart by invisible forces. "We're caught in a pulse," Lucas yelled over the chaos. "It's the gravitational interference. The core's emitting waves of energy. We can't break free unless we power through it." "We don't have the power to push through," Tessa retorted, gripping a handrail to steady herself. "If we try, we'll burn out the engines." Elara's mind raced as the pulse intensified. She could feel the tension in the air, an electric charge like the calm before a storm. The ship's shields were being taxed to their limits, flickering weakly under the strain. The entire crew was at risk of being pulled into the center of the void's gravity well, unless they could figure out a way to escape. "Lucas, Tessa, we don't have a choice," Elara snapped, her voice cutting through the noise. "We need to get to the core, or we're as good as dead." With a final, desperate push, Lucas brought the ship's engines to full throttle, the hum of the engines rising to a deafening crescendo. But as the ship hurtled forward, another tremor hit. This one stronger, more violent. The walls groaned, and a warning light flared to life on the console. "Shields failing," Lucas shouted. "We've got less than a minute before we lose." "Full containment," Elara's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the final push. The heart of the void it was unlike anything Elara had ever seen. The moment the ship crossed the threshold into the core of the void's power, the universe around them seemed to bend. Stars disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the pitch-black space that surrounded them. The void was a living, breathing entity. Its energy pulsed through the ship's systems, making the air crackle with static. The fabric of reality itself warped and twisted. The ship's sensors were overloaded, unable to process the sheer volume of data pouring in. Elara could feel it in her bones, the oppressive weight of something ancient, something powerful. The presence of the void pressed against her mind, like an invasive thought that refused to let go. This place. It's like a nexus, Lucas said, his voice barely audible as he continued to fiddle with the console. There's so much energy here. Too much. Elara's hand clenched into a fist. Focus, Lucas. We need to get to the heart. Whatever is powering this force, we need to destroy it. Tessa moved to Elara's side, her face pale, eyes wide with awe and fear. What if this is the beginning of something worse? What if we're too late? Elara met her gaze, her jaw set in determination. We stop it now. We don't let this darkness spread any further. We finish this. The ship continued to shudder as they advanced toward the heart of the void. The energy waves they had been encountering were stronger now, and every pulse of power seemed to draw them deeper into the center of the storm. There were no signs of life out here. No fleets, no armies, just endless darkness and the constant hum of energy. Then, without warning, the ship was pulled into a gravitational vortex. The entire vessel shook violently as it was sucked downward, spiraling toward an enormous pulsating structure at the center of the void. It was a massive, dark, pyramid-like structure, built from what appeared to be living metal, a structure that seemed to feed off the very fabric of space and time. We're being pulled in, Tessa cried. We can't control the ship. The force of the pull was overwhelming. Elara could hear the groan of the ship's hull as it was ripped through space, the walls buckling under the pressure. We have no choice, Lucas shouted, his hands flying over the controls. We have to engage the destabilizer. It's our only chance. Elara nodded. The destabilizer was a last resort weapon, designed to disrupt massive gravity fields. If they used it here, they might be able to break free, but it would come at a terrible cost. The ship would be destabilized, and they would have to make crash landing, assuming they even survived the process. Do it, Lucas, now! Without another word, Lucas activated the weapon, and the ship lurched again as a wave of energy pulsed outward. The massive pyramid loomed ahead of them, its surface rippling like the surface of water, as if it were alive, sentient even. Then everything exploded into light. The final confrontation, when Elara opened her eyes, she was no longer on the ship. She stood in a vast, empty space, an endless chasm stretching far into the distance, filled with swirling shadows and strange, shifting shapes. The very ground beneath her feet seemed unstable, shifting like liquid stone, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. This was no longer a battle fought in the physical realm. It was a confrontation in the realm of the void itself, the heart of the void. Elara. Her name echoed through the darkness, and she spun around, her pulse quickening. It was Orphan. His massive form materialized before her, his eyes burning with violet energy, his body surrounded by swirling dark matter. His expression was twisted, a grotesque mask of rage and power. You think you can stop me? Orphan's voice boomed, his words laced with mockery. You are nothing but mortals, bound to the limits of your frail existence. You cannot comprehend the power of the void. Elara clenched her fists, feeling the surge of energy from the cradle still coursing through her veins. She wasn't just fighting Orphan anymore. She was fighting the void itself. I don't need to comprehend it, Elara said, her voice steady. I just need to stop it. With that, she charged forward, the power of the cradle surging through her body. The air around her crackled with energy, her every step leaving an imprint of light behind her. She was no longer just Elara. She was the last hope for Earth, and nothing, not even the void, could stand in her way. Chapter 19. The Shattering of the Void. The air crackled with energy as Elara faced the manifestation of Orphan, his towering dark form flickering like a mirage. Her heart pounded as the power of the void surrounded her, an overwhelming force that seemed to claw at her mind, pressing in on every side, testing her limits. Her breath came in quick gasps, but she stood tall, her mind focused on the single goal that had kept her alive: to stop this darkness. "You can't stop me, Elara," Orphan's voice echoed, each word vibrating in her chest, sending shudders through her body. His eyes, burning orbs of violet energy, seemed to see straight through her, cutting through her resolve. "You cannot comprehend what you are dealing with. The void is eternal. It cannot be defeated by your petty strength." Elara clenched her fists. The void had been with her since the moment she had first stepped into the fight, constantly shifting, never fully tangible, and always threatening to swallow everything in its path. But the key was in her hands now. The power of the cradle, the ancient Goros technology, and the deep knowledge that the universe was more than the blackness that surrounded them. It was all coming together in a final push. "You're wrong, Orphan," she said, her voice steady despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "This is where it ends. You end." With a roar, Orphan extended his hand, and the void surged forward, crashing into Elara like a physical force, throwing her backward. Her body collided with the shifting ground beneath her feet, the impact rattling her bones. For a moment, everything went dark as the void's energy seemed to suffocate the light around her. "Elara," Tessa's voice cut through the darkness, but it sounded distant, muffled as if coming from far away. Elara blinked, forcing her vision to clear as she pushed herself off the ground. Her body ached, but the surge of adrenaline kept her moving. The darkness of the void swirled around her, the very air heavy with a thick, palpable malevolence. She could feel its tendrils creeping into her mind, filling her thoughts with doubts, feeding her fears. It was the very thing she had fought against, her entire life, the thing that had caused countless suffering across the galaxy. But Elara wasn't afraid, not anymore. Pushing herself to her feet, she activated the cradle's power. The ancient energy coursed through her veins, burning through the darkness like fire. The cradle's technology responded, its circuits humming, with life as Elara reached into its core, amplifying the energy it gave her. As she focused, the energy around her pulsed, a brilliant light flaring from within her. The void recoiled, its tendrils jerking back as if they feared the light. Orphan faltered for a moment, his form flickering, but then he bellowed in fury. "You think you can stand against me?" Orphan spat, his voice seething with rage. "The void is not a thing of light. It is the darkness that feeds on every star, every soul. You cannot resist it." Elara didn't answer. Instead, she directed all of her will into the cradle's power, drawing the light of the universe toward her. She felt the energy building inside her, an incredible, unstoppable force. She raised her hand and a burst of light exploded from her palm, cutting through the void's darkness. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had frozen. The void around them was bathed in light, the swirling blackness faltering before the brilliance of the power Elara had unleashed. She could hear the faintest hum, the whispers of an ancient, forgotten power vibrating through the air. The void was fighting to survive, to consume, but it was weakening under the pressure. Then Orphan's voice returned, dark and guttural, echoing around them like a storm. "You cannot defeat what is eternal," he said, stepping forward, his massive form towering over Elara. "The void has consumed worlds for eons. You are nothing but a flicker in the grand expanse." Elara's heart beat wildly in her chest, but she stood firm. "A flicker can burn down the night." Her words were a challenge, a declaration. And as she spoke, she saw it. The heart of the void, a swirling mass of dark energy, coalescing into something tangible, something almost sentient. It was an entity, or perhaps a force, a singular, terrifying power that represented the very core of the void itself. The energy around her intensified, and Elara, gritting her teeth, raised both hands. With a final surge of willpower, she sent the cradle's energy hurtling toward the dark mass at the center of the void. The force collided with the heart of the void, and the explosion that followed was beyond anything Elara could have prepared. For it wasn't just an explosion, it was a shattering, a rupture in the very fabric of existence itself. The void's heart trembled, ripples of darkness spreading outward like a shockwave. But this time it was no longer in control. The very power that had sustained it, that had fed it for so long, began to collapse under its own weight. The energy inside Elara flared brighter, and for a brief moment it felt as though the universe itself held its breath. But then, Orphan screamed, the sound of his voice rising to a crescendo of fury and agony. "You dare?" he bellowed, his form writhing in pain as his body began to flicker and distort. The energy around him grew unstable, crackling as if reality itself was fraying at the edges. Elara could feel the battle, both in her mind and her body, reach its peak. The void's hold on her, on everything, was weakening. She could see it in Orphan's face, in the twisted, contorted expression of fury and desperation. The void, the darkness, was finally breaking apart. With one final push, Elara called upon the cradle's last, most powerful surge of energy. The light exploded outward, a massive pulse of raw power that slammed into Orphan, engulfing him in blinding brilliance. The very essence of the void recoiled, the darkness ripping apart as if it were nothing more than paper in the wind. Orphan howled one last time, his voice diminishing as the light consumed him. And then, nothing. The space around Elara fell silent. The void was gone. The oppressive, consuming darkness that had threatened to swallow the universe had finally been broken. For a long moment, Elara stood alone, breathing heavily, her body trembling from the effort. The cradle's power was still pulsing through her, but it was fading, its energy spent. She had done it. She had stopped it. The void, Orphan, and the endless night that had been poised to destroy everything were no more. But as the darkness dissipated, the faintest glimmer of light began to return to the cosmos. "Elara?" Tessa's voice echoed in her ear, distant but familiar. "Elara, are you okay?" Elara opened her eyes and looked around. The dark chasm of the void had vanished. The endless, consuming night was no longer there. It was as if the entire galaxy had been reborn. The stars were no longer blocked by the darkness, and she could see the vastness of the cosmos once more, a cosmos that had been saved. "Elara!" Lucas's voice joined Tessa's, filled with relief and joy. "You did it! You really did it!" Elara smiled weakly, feeling the weight of everything, of the battle, of the loss, of the immense power she had wielded. "We did it," she whispered. "We're not done yet. But we won." The faintest glimmer of hope had returned, and Elara knew that the journey ahead was still uncertain. But in that moment, she realized that they had succeeded, against all odds, and the universe had a chance to heal once more. Chapter 20. Rebirth of the Cosmos. The stars above had always been a symbol of hope, points of light scattered across the vast, endless black of the cosmos. Yet now, as Elara gazed upward, she saw them not just as distant objects in the night, but as markers of a new beginning. The void had been shattered. The darkness that had threatened to swallow everything was no more. The universe was no longer under the weight of an ancient power, an entity that had grown far beyond its original purpose. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elara breathed deeply, the air around her not heavy with fear, but light with possibility. Her body, though exhausted and sore, felt free. The cradle's energy, that ancient power that had coursed through her veins, was fading now. Its pulse was softer, like the last embers of a fire that had burned hot and fierce. She stood on the bridge of the ship, her crew around her, each of them feeling the shift in the air, the difference between what was and what could be. "It's over," Tessa said quietly, her eyes wide as she looked at the view outside the ship's windows, where the once ominous darkness had dissolved into starlight. "We really did it." Elara nodded, her gaze unwavering, though her thoughts were far from settled. She had destroyed the heart of the void, shattered Orphan's reign of terror, and freed countless worlds from a fate of endless suffering. But there was still so much uncertainty. The universe, though no longer under the void's shadow, had been irrevocably changed. The scars left by the long battle would not fade easily. How long until we reach Earth? Elara asked, turning toward Lucas, who had been absorbed in the ship's navigation system since they had begun their journey back from the core. Shouldn't take too long, Lucas replied, his voice sounding almost distant, as though his mind was still processing everything that had happened. We've got the coordinates locked. The energy from the cradle is still resonating, so navigation's easier now. We'll be there within a few days. Elara closed her eyes for a brief moment. It felt surreal, like a dream that was slowly beginning to fade, only the truth of it remaining in the back of her mind. The war was over, but what came next was still unknown. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What do we do with what we've learned? With the power of the cradle? Tessa stepped forward, her expression contemplative. It's not just about the power, it's about how we use it. We can rebuild. We can use the knowledge we've gained to help the worlds we saved, those who need us. Maybe we can teach them how to harness their own potential, not just destroy, but create. We don't need to conquer. We need to guide. Elara smiled, though it was tinged with a quiet sadness. But that's not an easy task. There's a lot of healing that needs to happen before we can even think about rebuilding. People, the universe itself. There's a deep wound we've just scratched the surface of. There always is, Lucas said, his voice gentle. But we can't let fear of the future stop us from trying to make it better. You showed that, Elara. You gave us hope when we thought it was gone. The truth of those words weighed heavily on Elara. There was no turning back from what they had done. They had freed entire galaxies, but they had also released a power that was beyond comprehension. The cradle, the force that had driven them to this point, still held mysteries that had yet to be fully unlocked. She turned to the console, activating a series of commands. The navigation system hummed as the ship adjusted its course. The faintest of smiles tugged at her lips, though it was bittersweet. As the ship moved further away from the remnants of the void, a quiet thought echoed in the back of her mind. What would she do when they returned to Earth? Would they be welcomed? Or would they face a world still too shaken by the horrors they had fought against to accept the truth of their victory? A new dawn. 3 days later, the ship descended into Earth's atmosphere, and the world they had once known seemed almost unrecognizable. The landscape below had changed over the years of war, with cities abandoned and overgrown. Nature, reclaiming much of the space that had once been teeming with humanity. Yet there was a sense of life beneath the surface, a rebirth that seemed to linger in the air. Elara stood at the front of the ship, staring down at the planet. The scars left by the void were still visible, but there was an undeniable glimmer of life. This is it, Tessa said softly, standing next to her. It's our home. It's where we've been fighting for. Elara's eyes softened as she gazed down. It doesn't feel like the same place we left behind. It won't be. Nothing is the same after everything we've been through, Tessa replied, her voice full of emotion. But we can make it a better place. We've been given that chance. The ship touched down on the surface with a soft thud, settling on the rocky terrain. The crew disembarked slowly, stepping onto the land that had once been their home. The air was cooler now, a light breeze carrying the scent of the earth. It was familiar, but different. The destruction and death that had threatened the world were no more, but the aftermath remained. They were survivors, and they were not alone. As they made their way through the ruined city, Elara found herself lost in thought. The streets, once crowded with people, were empty now. Yet in the distance she could see signs of life, small groups of people moving carefully through the rubble, working together to rebuild. It was a slow process, but it was progress, and that was all that mattered. We need to help them. Elara said, her voice quiet but resolute. The people who are still out there, they need to know they're not alone. Lucas and Tessa nodded in agreement. They had fought for this moment, for the chance to give humanity another chance at survival. But it wasn't just about survival. It was about finding purpose in a world that had almost lost everything. We'll teach them what we've learned, Tessa said, her eyes determined. We'll share what we know about the cradle, how to rebuild. We'll give them the tools to move forward. And we'll protect them, Elara added. We've seen what happens when darkness takes hold. We won't let that happen again. They walked through the city, meeting the survivors who were starting to piece their lives back together. The people were wary at first, their faces etched with fear and skepticism. But as Elara and her team spoke to them, as they shared their knowledge and their hope, something began to change. A light, faint but real, began to shine in their eyes. And then from the distance, a voice called out, Are you really back? Elara turned and her heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the edge of the ruins, was a group of survivors, their faces familiar, faces from her past, people she thought she had lost. Elara, one of them whispered, taking tentative steps forward. You came back. You really did it. You stopped it. Elara smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest as she walked toward them. We did, all of us. The survivors gathered around, tears in their eyes, but there was no more fear. Only relief. Only the realization that they had a future now. A new era. The next few months were a blur. The crew of the ship worked tirelessly, not only helping to rebuild Earth, but also sharing the knowledge they had gained from their journey, teaching people how to harness the power of the cradle, how to build a future not on conquest, but on cooperation. The universe was vast and humanity was no longer isolated. With the lessons of the past and the technologies they had discovered, they could face whatever came next. But it was a long road ahead. Earth was far from fully recovered, and the scars of the void would take time to heal. Yet as Elara stood, once more beneath the stars looking up at the familiar sky, she felt a quiet hope. The universe was no longer lost. It had been saved, and she had played a part in that. In the end, the victory had not just been about stopping the darkness, it had been about finding the light. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Let me know in the comments what ideas you would like the next story to be about. Please leave a thumbs up, share, subscribe, comment.